Hi guys! Tonight we begin not with castles or crowns, but with soil pressing gently against your palms. You are standing barefoot on damp medieval earth, the kind that smells faintly of roots and cold iron. Above you, the wind worries the treetops. Below you, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the promise of silence. This is where it starts, not with ambition, but with fear, patience, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the safest place is not behind walls, but beneath them. You crouch and let your fingers dig into the ground. It yields easily. Dark and forgiving. Medieval people knew this feeling well. Long before stone houses felt secure, earth felt familiar. You probably won't survive this if you think medieval life was all heroic battles and warm hearths. Most days were colder, quieter, and far more uncertain than the stories suggest. When danger came, and it came often, you didn't always run. Sometimes, you disappeared. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. You let your eyes adjust as the story slides forward, downwards, into the soil itself. The medieval world above ground was loud with risk. Raiding bands moved like sudden storms. Tax collectors arrived without warning. Winters crept in early and refused to leave. You learn quickly that visibility is vulnerability. Stone houses draw eyes. Chimneys advertise warmth. Roads announce movement. But Earth hides things. Earth forgives footprints. Earth swallows sound. This is a mainstream historical truth scholars broadly agree on throughout medieval Europe, especially from the early to high Middle Ages. Ordinary people frequently used earth-sheltered spaces, cellars, dugouts, sunken rooms not just for storage, but for living and hiding. You weren't always planning to vanish forever. Sometimes you just needed to last the night. You kneel lower now, imagining how someone like you, no title, no banner, would see the land. You don't think in terms of architecture. You think in terms of survival. Where does water run when it rains? Where does frost linger? Where do footsteps sound hollow? These questions matter more than beauty. There's a quirky detail historians like to mention. Almost in passing, some medieval dugouts were deliberately built near large tree roots. Not to avoid them, but to use them. Roots reinforced ceilings, broke up outlines, and masked disturbances in the soil. To a passing soldier or taxman, the ground looked untouched. To you, it was shelter wearing a disguise. As you imagine this, you feel the psychological shift that must have come with choosing to live partly underground. Above ground, you react. Below ground, you wait. Time stretches differently. Sound changes. Even your breathing feels louder. The earth presses in, not threateningly, but insistently, reminding you of limits. Historians still argue whether these dugouts were primarily defensive refuges or simply practical extensions of everyday homes. Some believe fear drove their creation. Others argue cold storage and thermal stability were the real motivations, with secrecy just a useful side effect. You can almost feel that debate happening around you, like murmured voices in the dark, never quite settling. You reach for an imaginary iron spade, heavier than modern tools, its edge uneven from use. Digging is slow. This isn't frantic burrowing. It's careful, measured removal of soil basket by basket. You learn the rhythm: dig, scrape, listen, dig, scrape, listen. The ground tells you things if you pay attention. A sudden change in resistance warns of collapse. A damp smell suggests water trouble ahead. There's a strange intimacy here. The soil stains your hands, works into the lines of your skin. Medieval people lived with dirt constantly on floors, on clothes, under nails. Cleanliness was not absence of soil, but familiarity with it. Underground spaces felt honest in that way. No pretending, no polish. You pause And imagine the moment someone decided to go below, rather than build higher walls. It's not heroic. It's practical. Maybe you watched a neighbor's house burn. Maybe soldiers took livestock last winter. Maybe the Lord raised rents again. Or maybe the cold simply found every crack in your wooden walls. Whatever the reason, the conclusion was the same. The ground offers steadiness. A fringe theory, less accepted but endlessly fascinating, suggests some medieval communities intentionally planned clusters of hidden dugouts as a kind of silent village beneath the visible one. Not everyone agrees this was widespread, but a few archaeological sites hint at more coordination than once assumed. You imagine paths underground mirroring footpaths above. Secret but shared. As you sit with that thought, the sounds around you soften. The world above continues wind. Distant voices. Animals, but they're muffled now, as if wrapped in wool. This is the appeal. This is why Earth becomes ally rather than obstacle. You realize something else too. Living underground changes how you think about permanence. Stone promises longevity but attracts attention. Earth promises forgetfulness. When you leave, it heals itself. A collapsed entrance becomes just another patch of ground. In a world where memory can be dangerous, being forgotten is a kind of safety. Your breathing slows as you picture yourself lying back against packed soil walls. Listening. You are not hiding because you are weak. You are hiding because you are patient. Medieval survival often rewarded those who could wait quietly longer than danger could afford. Above you, the night deepens. Below you, the temperature remains steady. Cool but not cruel. The earth has its own logic, and you are learning to trust it. And as this first stretch of the journey settles in, you sense that going underground is not an act of desperation alone. It is a skill, a tradition, a quiet conversation between human and land that will continue, layer by layer. As you dig deeper into the medieval world, you remain low to the ground, knees pressed into soil that still holds the day's chill. Nothing dramatic happens when fear arrives in the medieval world. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It creeps. It settles. It teaches you habits. And one of those habits is learning when not to be seen. Above ground, danger has many faces. You learn to recognize them long before they reach you. The distant barking of dogs at the wrong hour. The sudden silence of birds. The sound of hooves when no travelers are expected. Fear sharpens your hearing first, then your judgment. You begin to understand why so many medieval people chose to dig rather than flee. Running exposes you. Roads funnel you. Forests are not always kind. But the ground beneath your own home, your own field, your own tree line, that ground belongs to you. It does not ask questions. It does not demand loyalty. It simply waits. This is one of those widely accepted historical realities that slips quietly into everyday life. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in borderlands, forest edges, and regions prone to raids, people did not rely on permanent fortifications. They relied on familiarity. Knowing where to hide mattered more than knowing how to fight. You picture yourself watching smoke rise from a nearby settlement. Not panic yet, just information. You do not grab weapons. You do not shout. You begin preparing the place below. That decision feels heavy but calm. Fear does not always feel like terror. Sometimes it feels like clarity. The ground becomes a promise because everything above it feels temporary. Lords change. Borders shift. Armies pass through and leave nothing but footprints and ash. Taxes increase without explanation. Food disappears in winter. The earth, however, stays where it is. There is a strangely practical side to medieval fear that modern minds sometimes miss. You are not hiding from monsters. You are hiding from systems. From power that does not care whether you survive. From men who see livestock and grain before they see faces. Digging is not cowardice. It is accounting. A curious tidbit that surfaces in local records and oral traditions is that some families prepared underground spaces long before they needed them. They were not panic shelters built in a single night. They were slow projects. Expanded season by season. a little deeper each year, a little wider, like saving coins, but in soil. You feel the patience of that process now. Fear does not rush you. It instructs you. Dig quietly. Do not leave obvious piles of soil. Spread it thin. Carry it away in baskets and scatter it under leaves or along riverbanks. Every action is deliberate. You are not just building a space. You are erasing evidence. Historians still debate how widespread this behavior truly was. Some argue that written sources exaggerate the frequency of hiding because fear makes for memorable stories. Others counter that archaeology consistently underrepresents underground shelters because the best ones leave almost no trace. The truth likely sits between these views. Buried, but present. You shift your weight and imagine the soundscape of fear. Above ground, it is chaotic. Shouting, metal clashing, animals panicking. Below ground, fear sounds different. It hums. It waits. It listens. You measure time by footsteps overhead, by voices passing, by silence returning. Winter fear is quieter but heavier. Cold does not raid. It surrounds. It presses into walls and bones. When the wind finds every crack in a wooden house, going underground is not secrecy. It is insulation. The earth holds a steady temperature that feels almost generous compared to frozen air. You are not hiding from people now. You are hiding from the season itself. This practical truth is well established. Earth-sheltered spaces maintain more stable temperatures year-round, warmer than winter air and cooler than summer heat. Medieval people did not calculate this with instruments. They learned it with their bodies. You learn it the same way now. By feeling the difference, there is a darker edge to fear too. Disease moves through villages without warning. Rumors spread faster than illness. Someone coughs. Someone dies. People whisper about curses or bad air. Going underground feels safer, even if that belief is not always correct. Fear does not require accuracy. It requires relief. A lesser-known idea, discussed quietly among scholars, suggests that underground hiding spaces also served psychological purposes. Being enclosed reduced panic. Limited choices can be calming. When you cannot run in 10 directions, you stop trying. You sit. You breathe. You endure. You imagine children learning these lessons early, taught when to be quiet, how to move without scraping walls, how to listen for changes in sound. Fear becomes part of education, not through lectures, but through routine. When the signal comes, you go below. No questions. There is no heroism here. No speeches. Just repetition. Just knowing where to place your feet in the dark. Just trusting that waiting is sometimes the strongest response available. Above you, the world continues to threaten without caring whether you watch it. Below you, fear becomes manageable. Smaller. Contained. You are not braver underground. You are smarter. As the soil cools your palms and the imagined space around you grows clearer, you realize something essential. Medieval people did not build dugouts because they loved darkness. They built them because fear taught them where survival actually lived. And that lesson, once learned, is not easily forgotten. You move slowly now, not because the ground resists you, but because choosing the right place matters more than speed. A medieval dugout lives or dies by its location. You feel this instinctively as you walk the edge of a forest. Boots brushing fallen needles and damp leaves. The land speaks quietly here. If you know how to listen, you are not looking for the lowest ground. That would invite water. You are not looking for the highest either. That would expose you. Instead, your eyes drift to gentle slopes, places where rain naturally runs away rather than pooling. A shallow incline is enough. It lets gravity do the work later, carrying moisture downhill while your shelter stays dry. This understanding shows up again and again in surviving evidence. Sunken medieval dwellings and hidden dugouts often appear just off ridgelines or tucked into hillsides, rather than directly beneath flat fields. People learned, through long experience, that water is a more patient enemy than soldiers. It never tires. It never leaves. You pause near a stand of old trees. Their roots snake across the surface like frozen veins. This is not a problem. It is an opportunity. Thick roots break up soil patterns and make disturbed earth harder to detect. They also stabilize ceilings when left intact. You imagine digging around them carefully, treating them not as obstacles but as allies. An overlooked detail found at several sites suggests that builders sometimes selected locations where fallen leaves naturally accumulated. Leaf litter disguised subtle changes in ground texture and softened footprints. When danger passed through, the earth above your shelter would look no different from the forest floor around it. You crouch and press your palm flat against the soil. It feels firm but workable. Sandy ground collapses too easily. Heavy clay holds water. Loam, dark and crumbly, is ideal. Medieval people did not name soil types the way modern science does, but they knew them by feel. You learn the same way now. Choosing a hidden spot is also about sound. You stamp lightly. The earth answers with a dull thud rather than a hollow echo. Good. Hollow ground betrays itself. Footsteps above should sound ordinary. Unremarkable. Nothing that would make someone pause and wonder what lies beneath. You think about proximity next. A shelter too close to your home risks discovery if the house is searched. Too far. And reaching it becomes dangerous. Many hidden dugouts sat just beyond daily activity zones, near woodpiles, hedgerows, or animal pens, places where movement was expected and therefore ignored. This pattern appears consistently in rural medieval landscapes. Hidden spaces were rarely isolated. They blended into working environments. A person walking to fetch firewood would not look suspicious. A farmer checking a fence would not draw attention. Everyday tasks became camouflage. There is still disagreement over how intentional this blending truly was. Some researchers believe people consciously designed shelters to merge with routine paths. Others argue it was simply convenience that placed dugouts near work areas. Both explanations fit the evidence, and neither excludes the other. You sense how blurred intention and habit can become when survival is at stake. You notice how light filters through branches overhead. Dappled, uneven, shifting. This matters too. Direct sunlight dries soil quickly and reveals disturbances. Shade keeps moisture stable and shadows forgiving. A shelter entrance, hidden beneath a bush or fallen log, benefits from darkness even during the day. A curious practice mentioned in a handful of regional accounts suggests that some builders delayed finishing entrances until the last moment. The space below existed, ready, but the surface above remained untouched until danger approached. Only then would the final covering be placed. Once sealed, it vanished back into the landscape. You imagine how that would feel? Knowing the refuge is there, invisible, waiting. The land itself becomes part of your plan. You are no longer separate from it. You are borrowing space temporarily, trusting that it will keep your secret. Smell enters your thinking next. Smoke, waste, food, bodies. Odors rise. A poorly placed dugout betrays itself through scent long before sight. Locations downwind of common paths reduce risk. Earth absorbs some smells. But not all. Medieval people paid attention to prevailing winds without naming them as such. You feel the breeze now, light but steady, and file that information away. The forest edge offers another advantage. Noise travels unpredictably among trees. Footsteps scatter. Voices fragment. Even if someone passes close by, sound does not carry cleanly. You imagine lying still below while conversations blur into meaningless murmurs above. Not all dugouts were rural. In towns, hidden cellars appeared beneath workshops, taverns, and even churches. In those cases, the chosen spot relied less on landscape and more on human traffic. Noise and movement masked everything. What mattered was access and discretion. The record is less clear here. Urban secrecy leaves fewer traces. Some scholars believe many such spaces went entirely undocumented, either because they were destroyed or because no one ever admitted they existed. You can feel how secrecy protects itself by erasing its own story. You step back and take in the imagined site as a whole. Slope, trees, soil, sound, smell, habit. Every factor layers together. No single choice guarantees safety, but together they create obscurity. And obscurity, more than strength, is what you are after. You realize something subtle. Choosing the right place is not only about hiding from others. It is also about living with yourself underground. Claustrophobia, dampness, darkness. A bad location makes every hour heavier. A good one allows waiting without panic. You picture yourself returning to this spot again and again, checking it, maintaining it, trusting it. It becomes familiar, comforting. Even, not because it is pleasant, but because it is predictable. Predictability is a rare luxury in the medieval world. As you settle on this place, you feel the quiet satisfaction that comes from a decision made carefully. The ground accepts you. The trees stand indifferent but useful. The slope promises dryness. Nothing marks the spot. Nothing gives it away. And as you kneel there, ready to begin shaping the space below, you understand that secrecy starts long before digging. It begins with choosing ground that already knows how to keep a secret. You return to the chosen place carrying very little, because medieval digging is not about abundance. It is about persistence. The tools in your hands are simple, worn smooth by years of use. An iron spade with a slightly uneven edge, a wooden shovel reinforced with bands of metal, a wicker basket that creaks softly when filled. None of these look impressive, but each one knows its job. You kneel and press the spade into the earth for the first cut. The sound is dull and restrained. Nothing like stone striking stone. That matters. Sharp noises travel. Earth absorbs sound the way cloth absorbs breath. This is one reason people trusted digging more than building. You can work quietly, slowly, without announcing yourself to the world. There is firm evidence that iron tools became increasingly common in rural medieval life. Even among peasants, hoes, spades, mattocks, and simple picks were not luxuries. They were necessities for farming. You already own them. Using them to dig a shelter is not a special project. It is an extension of daily labor. You lift soil carefully, not in great scoops, but in manageable amounts. Each basket is carried away, scattered thinly among leaves, dumped into streams, or spread across fields where disturbed soil will not raise suspicion. Digging underground teaches you to think backwards. The hole is only half the work. The disappearance of what you remove is just as important. Your hands blister. Your back tightens. Medieval labor leaves no room for romantic ideas about craftsmanship. This is not artistry. It is endurance. You stop often, listening, feeling for vibrations, checking the smell of the air. Fresh earth has a clean scent. Wet earth warns you of trouble. You begin shaping walls with intention. Straight edges collapse more easily. Rounded corners hold. You carve gentle curves, letting pressure distribute naturally. This understanding appears repeatedly in underground structures across medieval Europe. Builders without formal engineering knowledge still arrived at stable forms through experience and failure. One detail that often surprises people is how much wood went into underground shelters. You might imagine bare dirt walls, but that was rarely the goal. Wooden posts, planks, and woven branches reinforce ceilings and lined sides. You select timber carefully, oak if available, hazel or willow for flexibility, fresh wood bends, old wood snaps. You wedge support posts into place, testing each one with your weight before trusting it. The ceiling is the greatest danger. Collapse does not warn. It simply happens. You work from the top down, never undermining yourself. Dig. Support. Dig. Support. The rhythm becomes meditative. There is an unusual practice noted at a few sites where builders intentionally left tool marks visible inside the dugout. Not because they were careless, but because smooth walls trapped moisture. Rough surfaces allowed condensation to drip and run rather than pool. Survival often hides in details like this. Details you would never notice until they save your life. You pause to rest, leaning against the cool wall. The temperature is already different down here. Not warm, not cold, just steady. Your breath no longer fogs the air. This consistency is one of the great advantages of earth sheltering. You feel it before you understand it. Some experts believe medieval people actively planned their digging around seasonal rhythms. Excavation was often done in late summer or early autumn, when soil was dry and stable. Winter digging risked frozen ground, and spring rains risked collapse. Timing mattered as much as technique. You imagine digging by lamplight. The flame shielded, its glow swallowed by earth. Light is precious here. Too much smoke gives you away. Too little light risks injury. Balance becomes instinct. You learn how far to raise the lamp, how to angle it, how to read shadows on uneven walls. You scrape the floor level, then slope it slightly toward a shallow trench. Water will find its way down here eventually. It always does. You guide it before it can surprise you. This simple drainage channel may never be noticed by anyone else. But it is the difference between a usable shelter and a grave. A curious pattern appears in some medieval dugouts, where builders incorporated small niches into walls. These were not decorative. They held lamps, tools, food, or religious objects. Tucking items into walls kept floors clear and movement quiet. Every inch mattered when space was limited. You feel the quiet weight of the earth pressing in as the space takes shape. It is not frightening. It is reassuring. Above you, the world is unpredictable. Down here, every inch exists because you placed it there. Control is rare in medieval life. Underground, you reclaim a little of it. There is ongoing disagreement about how long it took to dig such shelters. Some estimates suggest weeks of intermittent work. Others argue months, spread across seasons. Both possibilities feel true. You dig when you can. You stop when you must. There is no deadline except survival. You wipe sweat from your brow, careful not to drip onto the floor where it might soften the soil. Small habits form quickly. You learn to move deliberately, to avoid sudden shifts, to respect the space you are creating. This shelter is not passive. It demands cooperation. You test the ceiling again, pressing upward gently. It holds. The posts do their work. The soil settles. Nothing moves. This moment of stillness feels earned. You sit quietly and listen. The earth hums faintly, a sound you would never hear above ground. As the space reaches a usable size, you feel a shift. What began as digging now feels like inhabiting. The shelter is no longer an idea. It is a place shaped by effort, restraint, and knowledge passed down without writing. You understand now why these shelters rarely followed identical designs. Each one responded to its ground, its tools, its builder. There were no plans. Only principles: stability, silence, concealment. You rest your hand against the wall and feel the cool firmness beneath your palm. This earth will remember your touch long after you leave. And if you have done your work well, no one else ever will. You pause before going any deeper. Because now the real risk begins. Digging is easy when the hole is shallow. It becomes dangerous when the weight of the earth above starts to matter. Medieval people learned this the hard way. Through collapse, injury, and quiet deaths that left no record. You do not rush this stage. You listen to the ground as if it were alive. You press your palm against the wall and feel for vibration. Solid soil answers with resistance. Loose soil crumbles. The difference is subtle, but your hands learn it quickly. You begin shaping the space not as a box, but as a series of gentle curves. Straight angles tempt collapse. Rounded walls share pressure. This instinct shows up again and again in underground medieval structures that have survived. There is clear evidence from preserved dugouts and sunken houses that builders favoured oval or circular chambers whenever possible. These shapes were not aesthetic choices. They were practical solutions discovered through repetition. When the ceiling presses evenly, the earth holds itself together. You widen the space slowly, never digging more than you can support in the same session. Each scoop of soil is followed by placement of timber. Wooden posts rise like quiet sentinels. Spaced carefully, too far apart and the ceiling sags. Too close and you waste precious material. You test each post by leaning your weight into it, trusting your body more than your eyes. Wood matters here more than stone. Stone is heavy and difficult to work quietly. Wood flexes. It absorbs shock. Fresh-cut timber bends slightly under pressure rather than snapping. Medieval builders understood this intuitively. They used what forests offered, selecting trunks that were straight, strong, and young enough to give without breaking. You fit crossbeams into notches carved by hand. No nails if you can avoid them. Metal creaks. Wood settles silently. The joints are snug, held by friction and gravity. When done well, they almost disappear into the structure. An often overlooked detail is how builders layered materials. A ceiling might consist of beams, then woven branches, then packed earth above. Each layer spreads weight and dampens movement. This method appears across different regions, suggesting shared knowledge passed by observation rather than instruction. You crawl forward, working from one supported section to the next. Never open a space before preparing its skeleton. Digging ahead of support is how people died. You imagine those lessons passed quietly between neighbors. Do this first. Never do that. Listen when the soil changes. You scrape gently, feeling for moisture. Damp soil weighs more. It shifts differently. When you find it, you adjust your plan. Maybe the ceiling lowers slightly. Maybe you add another post. Flexibility keeps you alive underground. There is a strange calm that settles over you as you work. Above ground, labor is loud and exposed. Below ground, it becomes intimate. Every movement matters. Every sound feels amplified, even when it is not. You breathe more slowly without realizing it. Some researchers suggest that medieval people deliberately kept underground ceilings low, not just to save effort, but to reduce risk. Less height means less weight, less air to heat, less space to support. Comfort mattered less than safety. You feel that logic guiding your choices now. You carve small ledges into the walls as you go. These are not shelves yet. They are anchors for future supports. Planning ahead keeps you from reopening finished sections later. Once a wall is stable, you disturb it as little as possible. There is a curious observation from a handful of excavated sites where collapsed dugouts appear to have been intentionally abandoned rather than repaired. This suggests builders knew when to stop. Sometimes the ground was simply not worth arguing with. Knowing when to give up was as important as knowing how to continue. You test the ceiling again. Tap gently with the handle of your spade. Solid earth answers with a muted sound. Hollow spaces echo faintly. You learn to recognize the difference. That echo is a warning. You reinforce before moving on. Time becomes difficult to track. Without sun or shadow, you rely on your body, hunger, stiffness, the smell of your lamp oil thinning. Medieval people did not wear watches. Underground. They did not need them. Work ended when it had to. You imagine the fear of collapse not as panic, but as constant awareness. It sharpens you, keeps movements deliberate, makes rest feel earned. There is no room for distraction here. A lesser-known detail from some regions suggests that builders sometimes left sacrificial supports in place. Posts meant to bear weight temporarily during digging, but later removed or allowed to decay once the earth settled. This shows a sophisticated understanding of soil behavior over time, even without formal theory. You decide where permanent supports must stay. Corners, junctions, the highest points of the ceiling, these become non-negotiable. Everything else remains flexible. You smooth the floor again, removing loose debris that could shift underfoot. A stumble underground is not harmless. You imagine carrying a child or guiding someone older through this space later. Stability must be shared. There is still disagreement among experts about how often medieval dugouts collapsed in use. Written sources rarely mention accidents. Archaeology finds some evidence of sudden abandonment. Whether collapse was rare or simply underreported remains unclear. What is certain is that fear of collapse shaped every decision you make here. You sit back and let the space breathe. The air feels steady. The ceiling holds. The walls curve inward slightly, as if embracing the pressure above. This is not comfort, but it is security. You realize that preventing collapse is not a single action. It is a mindset. It requires patience, humility, and respect for forces you cannot see. Medieval people lived close enough to danger that they learned these lessons early. You run your hand along the wall one last time, feeling for weakness, finding none. You allow yourself a quiet moment of relief. The earth accepts your shape. It holds. And as you prepare to move on to entrances and exits, you carry this lesson with you. Underground survival depends less on strength and more on restraint. You do not conquer the ground. You negotiate with it. You do not rush toward an entrance. That decision alone could undo everything you have built. A medieval dugout survives not because it exists, but because no one notices how to reach it. The doorway is the most dangerous part of the shelter. Walls hide. Ceilings protect. Entrances betray. You sit quietly in the half-finished space and imagine approaching it from above. What would your eyes see first? A patch of disturbed soil. A shadow that does not belong. A shape too regular to be natural. You learn to think like someone who does not know this place exists. The simplest entrances are rarely the safest. A straight shaft down is easy to dig, but also easy to discover. Medieval builders preferred angled access, a sloping passage that bends slightly, forcing anyone inside to turn before seeing the chamber. This reduces light spill and limits sound travel. It also buys you time if someone forces their way in. Surviving examples show that entrances were often narrower than expected, wide enough for one person. Never more. You feel the logic immediately. Narrow passages are easier to conceal, easier to block, and easier to defend if needed. Comfort is secondary to discretion. You begin shaping the access tunnel slowly. This is not a place for haste. You dig downward at a shallow angle, checking alignment constantly. Too steep and you risk slipping. Too shallow and the entrance stretches too far, increasing exposure. Balance guides your hands. There is a consistent pattern in medieval underground spaces where entrances align with existing features above ground. The base of a tree, the edge of a shed, a livestock enclosure. People hid access points in plain sight by placing them where disturbance was already expected. You imagine lifting a plank beneath a woodpile or sliding aside a feeding trough to reveal darkness below. One unusual detail appears in a handful of regional sites, where entrances were disguised as animal burrows. Loose soil, scattered straw, and irregular openings discouraged human curiosity while explaining disturbance naturally. It was clever and quietly effective. You test how light behaves in the passage. Even a small opening can funnel daylight deep underground if aligned poorly. You adjust the angle until light fades quickly, swallowed by the bend. Darkness is protection here. You learn to welcome it. Doors underground are rarely hinged in the way modern doors are. Hinges creak. Metal announces movement. Medieval entrances often relied on lift-out panels, sliding stones, or layered coverings of wood, turf, and soil. You design something that can be opened quickly from inside and sealed completely from above. You consider weight next. A heavy covering discourages tampering, but it must be movable. Many builders layered materials so that no single piece was overwhelming. A wooden panel supports packed earth. Above that, leaves, straw, or brush restore the natural surface. When done well, the entrance disappears entirely. You imagine sealing the entrance and waiting. The space grows darker. Sound dulls. Your breath feels louder. This is the moment the design proves itself. If air grows stale or panic rises, something has gone wrong. Airflow must remain invisible. A hidden entrance is useless if breathing gives you away. You test small gaps, allowing air to pass without light. Medieval builders often incorporated tiny ventilation paths, disguised as root channels or cracks in stone. These were not obvious holes, but subtle continuations of natural patterns. Some scholars point out that many underground entrances appear deliberately inconvenient. Low ceilings force crawling. Sharp turns require careful movement. This discourages casual exploration and limits how many people can enter at once. Inconvenience becomes security. You scrape the tunnel walls smooth enough to prevent falling soil but rough enough to grip with hands and feet. Slipping here would be disastrous. You imagine guiding others through this passage. Children, elders, people moving quietly under pressure. Every surface must cooperate. There is debate about whether medieval people prioritized quick access or complete concealment. Some entrances are easy to open but harder to hide. Others vanish entirely but require time to clear. The choice likely depended on expected danger. Short raids favor speed. Long threats favor invisibility. You test the covering repeatedly. Open. Close. Adjust. You listen for sound. Wood settling is acceptable. Scraping or knocking is not. You pad contact points with cloth or bark. Silence is crafted, not assumed. You think about what happens if the entrance is discovered. Panic is the enemy. A narrow passage slows intruders. A bend blocks line of sight. A movable panel can be pushed into place from inside. You rehearse these actions mentally. Preparation calms fear. A lesser-known practice mentioned in a few accounts suggests that some builders intentionally created false entrances. Shallow pits or blocked shafts nearby distracted attention while the true access lay elsewhere. Whether common or rare, the idea reveals how deeply people thought about deception. You finish shaping the entrance and sit back inside the chamber. The space feels complete in a new way now. It is no longer just a hole. It is a place with boundaries, with rules, with a controlled connection to the world above. You imagine the first time you use it in earnest. The signal comes. Voices carry closer than they should. You move quickly but not hurried. The covering lifts. You slip inside. The panel settles. Earth returns to stillness. Inside, you listen. Footsteps pass overhead. A voice pauses, then continues. The disguise works. The entrance holds its secret. Experts continue to differ on how often underground shelters were breached once discovered. Some believe discovery almost always led to disaster. Others argue that concealment alone prevented most confrontations. What remains clear is that entrances were treated with more care than any other part of the structure. You feel a quiet pride as you run your hand along the finished tunnel wall. This was not brute labor. This was planning, observation, respect for human behavior as much as for soil and wood. The entrance is where the outside world touches your refuge. You have shaped that contact carefully, limited it, controlled it. That control changes how you feel inside the space. You settle into the chamber and let your breathing slow. The earth above presses gently. The entrance waits, hidden and obedient. You are ready now for whatever comes next. You notice the air before you think about it. It feels different down here. Not stale, not fresh, just present. Breathing underground teaches you quickly that air is not guaranteed. It must be invited in, guided, and kept quiet. A shelter that hides perfectly but suffocates its occupants is a failure. You sit still and listen to your own breath. In the enclosed space, it sounds louder, closer. Medieval people learned to trust this awareness. Breathing became a measure of safety. If the air moved gently, everything else could wait. There is solid evidence that underground spaces across medieval Europe incorporated some form of ventilation. Even if subtle, people did not understand oxygen as a concept, but they understood discomfort, dizziness, and danger. Experience taught them what the body needed long before theory tried to explain it. You begin planning airflow the same way you plan stability, quietly and indirectly. Large openings invite light and sound. Small, winding paths invite air without attention. The trick is to let air travel where eyes cannot. You crawl toward the far end of the chamber and test different spots with a smouldering wick. Where the smoke drifts steadily. Air is moving. Where it lingers. You avoid digging further. This simple test appears repeatedly in descriptions of enclosed medieval spaces. Smoke tells the truth when eyes cannot. You carve a narrow channel upward, not straight to the surface, but angled and interrupted. A turn here, a narrowing there. Air moves easily through these paths. Sound does not. Light dies quickly. The channel mimics a root tunnel more than a chimney. One small but fascinating detail emerges from certain archaeological finds. Some ventilation paths were deliberately irregular, with slight expansions and constrictions. This slowed air just enough to prevent drafts that could stir smoke or reveal presence. Comfort and secrecy balanced each other carefully. You disguise the outlet above ground with natural features. A cluster of stones, dense brush, the hollow at the base of a tree. The opening is small enough to escape notice, large enough to keep you alive. You test it again with smoke. It moves. You smile faintly. You think about fire next. Fire brings warmth and light, but also danger. Smoke is a betrayal that travels upward whether you invite it or not. Medieval underground shelters often avoided open flames unless absolutely necessary. When they did burn, it was controlled, limited, and planned. There is strong agreement among researchers that many dugouts relied more on body heat, insulation, and stored warmth than on constant fire. Earth holds temperature steadily. Packed walls absorb heat and release it slowly. You feel this now as your body warms the space around you. When fire is used, it is small, a shallow hearth, a single lamp. You position it near airflow but never directly beneath a vent. Smoke disperses slowly, cooled and filtered by earth before it escapes. You learn patience here too. Nothing happens quickly underground. You imagine sitting with others in this space. Breathing becomes shared. You notice how stillness improves air quality. Movement stirs dust. Panic accelerates breath. Calm preserves comfort. The shelter teaches behavior as much as it provides protection. Some interpretations suggest that medieval people timed underground stays carefully to avoid air depletion. Short periods during raids. Longer stays only when multiple vents existed. The evidence is incomplete. But logic supports it. You would not remain here indefinitely unless conditions allowed it. You test humidity next. Damp air chills the body faster than dry air. Ventilation helps regulate moisture as much as oxygen. You scrape a small channel along the floor leading toward the entrance passage, encouraging moisture to migrate away from the living space. An unusual observation from a few sites indicates that some builders placed absorbent materials near vents. Straw, cloth, charcoal. These materials trapped moisture and odors, quietly improving air quality. Whether intentional or discovered by accident, the effect would have been noticeable. You listen again. The space is not silent. It hums faintly. Air moves. Earth settles. Your breath joins the rhythm. This is what safety sounds like underground. There is still uncertainty about how people learned these techniques in the first place. Some believe knowledge spread through trial and loss. Others think it came from observing natural shelters like animal burrows or caves. Both ideas likely hold truth. Humans learn by watching what survives. You adjust the vent opening slightly, widening it by a finger's width. The air responds, cooler, fresher, not rushing. You stop there. Too much adjustment invites risk. Enough is enough. You realize that ventilation is not a finished feature. It requires monitoring. Conditions change. Seasons shift. Snow can block openings. Leaves can clog channels. Medieval people checked vents regularly, even during danger, because neglect could be fatal. You imagine lying here during winter, breath rising faintly, air circulating just enough to keep lungs clear. Outside, snow piles deep, wind scours the land. Inside, the earth holds steady. There is debate among specialists about whether underground shelters ever became fully self-sustaining living spaces or remained temporary refuges. Ventilation plays a key role in this question. Simple systems support short stays. More complex ones allow longer habitation. The variety of designs suggests both existed. You sit back and let the air move around you. The space feels complete in a new way. Walls hold. Ceiling supports. Entrance hides. Air flows. These elements work together quietly. Invisibly. You take one last breath and feel gratitude for something as simple as invisible movement. Air is easy to ignore until it disappears. Medieval people did not have that luxury. Underground. They paid attention. As you settle deeper into the shelter, breathing slow and measured, you understand that survival below ground is not about shutting the world out completely. It is about letting in only what you need. Nothing more. You feel the cold before you try to fight it. Underground does not mean warm by default. It means steady. The earth takes the sharp edge off winter, but it does not offer comfort on its own. Medieval people learned quickly that warmth below ground had to be managed carefully, because fire solves one problem while creating another. You sit quietly and notice how your body heat gathers in the space. The walls feel cool to the touch, but not biting. The floor holds a faint chill that seeps upward if you stay still too long. This is the balance you must work with. Too much heat draws attention. Too little drains strength. There is strong agreement among historians that most underground shelters relied on insulation rather than active heating. Earth itself becomes a thermal blanket. Thick walls slow heat loss. Low ceilings trap warm air close to the body. You experience this as you shift closer to the center of the chamber. Away from vents and entrance passages, you lay down branches, straw, or woven mats on the floor. Bare earth steals warmth. Even a thin layer changes everything. Medieval households already used these materials above ground. Bringing them below is not innovation. It is adaptation. You consider fire again. A large hearth is impossible here. Smoke would gather and rise, tracing your position like a finger pointing from the sky. Instead, you think in terms of controlled warmth. A small oil lamp, a covered ember, something that glows rather than burns. Archaeological evidence supports this restraint. Many underground shelters show little sign of open fires. When fire traces appear, they are small and localized. This suggests limited use. Perhaps only during the coldest moments or when secrecy mattered less than survival. You position a shallow fire pit near a vent, but not beneath it. Heat rises. Smoke follows. By placing the fire slightly aside, you allow warmth to spread while smoke drifts toward airflow without drawing attention. You test this with a faint flame. The smoke thins. It moves. It disappears. You learn to read the fire like a language. A steady flame means air is balanced. Flickering suggests a draft. Dimming warns of suffocation. Fire becomes a tool for measuring the shelter's health as much as a source of comfort. There is a lesser-known practice hinted at in a few medieval accounts where heated stones were used instead of open flames. Stones warmed above ground could be carried below, wrapped in cloth, and placed near sleeping areas. They released heat slowly and silently. No smoke. No light, just warmth. You imagine doing this at dusk, before danger fully settles, heating stones at a common hearth above, then slipping them below as night closes in. The act feels almost ritualistic, preparation rather than reaction. You arrange sleeping areas away from entrances and vents. Cold air creeps along passages. Warmth settles deeper inside. Medieval shelters often show signs of intentional zoning. Storage near cooler edges. Resting areas near the heart of the space. You curl slightly and notice how body heat changes the chamber. Breath warms the air. Skin radiates warmth into walls that will give it back slowly. Sharing a space multiplies this effect. Families huddled underground conserved heat simply by staying close. There is ongoing debate about how many people these shelters were designed to hold. Some argue they were meant for entire households. Others believe they were emergency refuges for a few. Heating considerations support both ideas. More bodies mean more warmth, but also more air demand. Balance dictates numbers. You manage clothing next. Medieval layers were heavy, often wool or fur lined. Underground. Too many layers cause sweating. Sweat chills quickly. You adjust, removing outer garments once the space warms. This feels counterintuitive, but experience teaches you better than instinct. You keep materials close. Extra cloth. Spare straw. Warmth is something you manage constantly, not something you set and forget. You check the walls for condensation. Moisture steals heat. Ventilation must continue, even when cold tries to convince you otherwise. One unusual observation from certain excavated shelters shows soot marks far lower than expected on walls. This suggests fires were kept small and low, not built up toward ceilings. Heat was directed toward bodies, not air above. Efficiency mattered more than brightness. You sit with your back against the wall and feel the earth absorb your warmth. It does not reflect heat like stone. It stores it. This creates a gentle cycle. The longer you remain, the more comfortable the space becomes. This is why sudden movement in and out feels jarring. You imagine winter above ground, wind clawing at walls, snow forcing its way through cracks, animals freezing where they stand. Underground, the storm becomes distant. You hear it faintly, if at all. Warmth becomes something you protect quietly, like a secret. Some scholars suggest that underground heating methods influenced later, above-ground building practices. Low ceilings, central hearths, thick walls. Whether direct or coincidental, the parallels are striking. People carried lessons upward when they could. You learn to sleep differently here, curled, wrapped, facing away from drafts, breathing slow, fire dimmed or extinguished. Darkness deepens, but warmth remains. The shelter teaches you to trust stillness. You adjust the covering over the entrance slightly, tightening gaps against cold air. You never seal it completely. Fresh air must move, even slowly. Cold air that moves is safer than warm air that does not. There is still uncertainty about how people balanced warmth and secrecy during extended underground stays. Evidence suggests constant adjustment rather than fixed solutions. You believe it. This space feels alive in its own way. Responsive. You touch the stones near the fire pit. Warm. Not hot. Enough. You are not trying to recreate comfort. You are trying to preserve strength. Underground warmth is about endurance, not luxury. As you settle into the quiet, the cold retreats to the edges. The center holds steady. Your breathing slows. Your muscles unclench. You are warm enough to wait. And waiting, in the medieval world, is often the truest measure of survival. Darkness settles into the shelter like a second set of walls. It is not the sudden darkness of nightfall above ground, where the moon still outlines shapes and snow reflects faint light. This darkness is deeper. It absorbs detail. It removes distance. You learn quickly that underground. Sight becomes suggestion rather than certainty. You pause and let your eyes adjust. At first, everything feels gone. Then slowly, forms return. The curve of the wall, the outline of the entrance passage, the faint glow of a lamp shielded behind your hand. Medieval people lived with this transition often enough that it stopped feeling dramatic. Darkness became familiar, even useful. There is broad agreement among historians that underground shelters were intentionally kept dim. Even when light sources were available, bright light wastes fuel and draws attention. It also sharpens shadows, exaggerating movement. Soft, limited light keeps the space calm and controlled. You move carefully, memorizing the layout with your feet and hands. Underground life trains the body to navigate without relying on sight. You learn where the floor slopes, where the ceiling dips, where the wall curves inward. Memory replaces vision. You place a small lamp in a wall niche and turn it low. The flame barely flickers. The light does not fill the chamber. It creates a pool, leaving edges undefined. This is enough. You do not need to see everything. You need to see just enough. Oil lamps were common in medieval households, especially among those who could afford animal fat or vegetable oil. Underground, their use changes. Lamps are smaller, wicks are trimmed shorter, flames are watched closely. Light becomes something you ration. You notice how darkness sharpens other senses. Sound grows larger. The faint drip of moisture, the soft scrape of cloth, your own breathing. Touch becomes more informative. You feel the wall before you see it. You count steps without thinking. An often overlooked detail from descriptions of underground spaces is how people oriented themselves using consistent markers. A rough patch on the wall, a support post, a hanging cloth. These landmarks replaced windows and doors. You choose one now, resting your hand there whenever you need reassurance. You imagine children learning this space, taught not to run, not to reach suddenly, not to cry out. Darkness becomes part of education, not as fear, but as expectation. You do not tell children to be brave. You teach them to be quiet. There is still disagreement about whether medieval people feared darkness more than modern audiences assume. Some argue that living without constant artificial light made darkness less threatening. Others believe fear never disappears. It only becomes familiar. Sitting here, you feel both ideas coexist. You test how light behaves again. Even a small flame throws shadows that move when you move. These shadows can confuse. You learn to keep light behind you when possible, illuminating the space ahead without revealing motion at the entrance. In some shelters, evidence suggests that people used reflective surfaces like pale stone or bone to bounce light gently, not to brighten the room, but to soften darkness. The effect would be subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it reduces strain on the eyes. You close the lamp for a moment and sit in complete darkness. At first it feels heavy. Then it settles. The space does not change. The walls remain. The air moves. Darkness does not erase reality. It simply removes distraction. You think about time. Without light, time loosens its grip. Minutes stretch. Hours blur. Medieval people underground measured time differently. By hunger, by fatigue, by the return of silence above. Darkness makes waiting easier because it removes the urge to watch. A curious observation from certain sites shows that soot patterns sometimes cluster near specific niches rather than spreading evenly. This suggests lamps were kept in fixed positions. Light stayed where it was needed. The rest of the space remained in shadow by design. You realize how darkness protects secrecy. A bright space leaks light through vents and entrances. A dim one swallows it. Even if someone passes close by, there is nothing to catch the eye. The shelter becomes invisible by doing less, not more. You lie back and let your eyes close. Darkness inside your eyelids matches darkness around you. This alignment calms the mind. There is no contrast to process. Sleep comes more easily when nothing competes for attention. You listen again for sound above. Nothing. Or perhaps something so distant it no longer matters. Darkness makes sound easier to interpret. A single footstep stands out. A voice echoes differently. You learn to distinguish threat from ordinary noise. There is ongoing discussion among scholars about whether extended darkness affected mental health in underground dwellers. Some suggest disorientation and anxiety would build. Others argue that routine and familiarity offset these effects. The truth likely depended on individual temperament and duration of stay. You adjust your position slightly, careful not to disturb the lamp. You know now how easy it is to knock something over in low light. Every movement is measured. Darkness encourages gentleness. You imagine emerging after hours or days below. Light would feel sharp. The world above would seem louder, faster. Underground darkness teaches patience by slowing perception itself. You open the lamp again just enough to check the space. Everything remains as you left it. Walls firm. Support steady. Air calm. Darkness has not changed anything. It has simply held the space quietly. You settle back and let the lamp dim once more. The shelter feels complete in this low light. Darkness is no longer absence. It is a feature, a tool, a companion. And as you rest here, breathing slow, surrounded by earth and shadow, you understand that medieval underground life was not about conquering darkness. It was about learning how to live gently inside it. Moisture announces itself quietly. You notice it first in the air, a faint coolness that clings to skin longer than it should. Underground. Water is never dramatic at first. It seeps. It creeps. It waits. Medieval people learned that ignoring it, even briefly, could undo months of careful work. You kneel and press your hand to the floor. It feels firm. Not slick. Good. Standing water is obvious and dangerous. But dampness is more subtle. It weakens walls. Rots wood. Chills. Bodies. You treat it as seriously as any human threat. You think back to the slope you chose above ground. That decision matters now. Rain follows gravity. Snowmelt seeks low points. By digging slightly into a hillside rather than flat ground, you have already reduced the amount of water that wants to find you. This is one of those quiet truths that appears again and again in surviving underground spaces. Location does half the work before tools ever touch soil. You carve shallow channels along the edges of the floor, guiding moisture toward the entrance passage rather than the center of the chamber. These channels are barely noticeable, but they give water somewhere to go. Medieval builders rarely tried to stop water completely. They redirected it instead. Evidence from excavated dugouts shows these drainage grooves in places that make little sense unless you imagine water moving through them. They curve gently, never cutting sharply across the space. Water, like earth, prefers cooperation to resistance. You pay close attention to the base of the walls. This is where moisture gathers first. You pack soil firmly, smoothing it without polishing. Smooth surfaces trap water. Slight texture allows droplets to run downward. This detail appears repeatedly in well-preserved underground structures. You notice condensation forming near the ceiling where warm air meets cool earth. Tiny beads gather and fall. You adjust ventilation slightly, allowing just enough airflow to reduce humidity without chilling the space. Moisture control is not a single action. It is constant awareness. You lay down a raised sleeping platform using wood and packed earth. Even a few inches of elevation keeps you away from damp ground. Medieval people understood this instinctively. You do not sleep where water wants to be. Straw and woven mats absorb moisture quickly, so you change them often. Old straw goes outside when it is safe, scattered where it blends into the environment. Fresh material replaces it. Clean does not mean spotless. It means functional. There is a small but revealing detail found in some underground shelters where stone or tile fragments line specific areas of the floor. These materials resist moisture better than bare earth. They are not decorative. They mark places where dryness mattered most. You test the space after rain, listening, smelling. Dampness has a scent. Earthy. Heavy. You learn to recognize it before you see it. Medieval survival depended on senses trained through repetition, not instruction. You think about water above ground. Streams swell. Paths turn to mud. Inside the shelter, conditions change slowly. This delay is both advantage and danger. Problems do not arrive suddenly, but they also do not leave quickly. You monitor rather than react. There is disagreement about how often medieval people stayed underground during prolonged wet seasons. Some researchers believe dugouts were avoided during heavy rains due to collapse risk. Others point to drainage features that suggest long-term use even in wet conditions. The evidence supports caution rather than certainty. You check wooden supports for signs of rot. Damp wood darkens, softens. You catch it early. Replace pieces when possible. Wood underground requires attention. Ignoring it invites quiet failure. You create a small sump near the entrance where water can collect harmlessly. From there, it drains out or evaporates slowly. This simple feature appears in multiple excavated shelters, though it is easy to miss unless you are looking for it. You notice how managing water changes behavior. Movements become deliberate. Items stay off the floor. Storage shifts upward. Moisture teaches organization through necessity. An unusual observation from certain sites suggests that builders sometimes lined walls with bark or hides during the wettest months. These materials shed water and protect earth surfaces temporarily. They were not permanent, but they bought time. You listen again to the shelter. Water makes sound when it moves. A drip, a trickle. Silence is ideal, but a predictable sound is manageable. Sudden new noises demand attention. You train yourself to notice change. You adjust the entrance covering after rain, ensuring water sheds away rather than pooling above. Even small depressions collect moisture. You smooth them out when conditions allow. Maintenance is quiet. Ongoing work. There is a broader lesson here. Medieval underground shelters were not static constructions. They were living spaces that required care. People who treated them as finished objects suffered. Those who treated them as systems adapted. You think about winter. Frozen ground traps moisture until thaw releases it suddenly. Drainage channels become critical then. You clear them ahead of time, anticipating what the season will bring. Some scholars argue that fear of dampness limited underground stays more than fear of discovery. Cold and wet sap strength faster than hunger. Sitting here, feeling the dry earth beneath you. That idea feels reasonable. You move your hand along the wall again. Cool. Firm. Dry enough. The shelter holds. Water has been guided away. Not defeated, but managed. You settle back and breathe. The air feels lighter. The floor feels solid. Moisture has not claimed this space today. And as you wait, listening to the distant world above, shift and soak and freeze, you understand something essential. Medieval underground survival depended not on keeping water out forever, but on learning how to live with its constant presence. Hunger is quieter underground, but it is no less real. You feel it not as urgency, but as calculation. How long can you stay? What can you eat without fire? What must be protected from damp, rot, and animals? Food storage below ground is not about abundance. It is about preservation and restraint. You begin by choosing where food belongs. Not near the entrance, where temperature shifts are strongest. Not near vents, where moisture and air move more freely. The center of the shelter offers the most stable conditions. Medieval people understood this without charts or measurements. They learned by losing food the wrong way. There is clear evidence from excavated underground spaces that storage pits and niches were carefully placed. Grain bins appear tucked into walls. Root vegetables rest in shallow hollows. Containers sit elevated on wooden platforms. Each choice reflects an understanding of how air, cold, and damp behave below ground. You run your fingers over a clay pot lid and feel its weight. Clay matters here. It breathes just enough. It resists rodents better than woven sacks. It does not rot like wood. Medieval households used ceramic vessels constantly, and underground they became even more important. You pack grain carefully. Not loose, not crushed. Each kernel matters. Grain stored underground stays cooler and more stable than above ground, slowing spoilage and discouraging pests. This practice appears across regions and centuries. It is one of the strongest reasons people trusted earth sheltering even when danger was not immediate. You add dried legumes next. Beans, peas, lentils. These store well and cook quickly when fire is possible. When it is not, they can still be soaked and eaten with patience. Underground living favors foods that forgive delay. Roots follow. Turnips, carrots, beets, wrapped in straw or packed into damp sand. They last far longer below ground than above. You keep them separate from grain. Moisture that preserves roots destroys seed. Separation is survival. There is a small but telling detail found in several medieval storage pits where herbs are scattered among food stores. Sage, rosemary, garlic. These were not only flavor, they discouraged insects and masked scent. Food storage underground was as much about smell as about spoilage. You think about meat. Fresh meat is dangerous here. It demands fire and creates waste. Preserved meat is different. Salted pork, smoked fish, dried strips of beef. These foods appear occasionally in underground contexts, usually stored high and wrapped tightly. You treat them with care. One mistake invites rot that spreads. You keep food in small quantities rather than large piles. If something spoils, you lose less. Medieval people understood risk management intuitively. Scarcity teaches caution. You test containers regularly, touching, smelling, listening. A hollow sound means grain has settled. A sour scent means trouble. You learn to act early. Remove compromised food before it poisons the rest. There is disagreement among historians about whether underground shelters were stocked in advance or supplied gradually during use. Some evidence suggests long-term preparation. Other signs point to hurried packing during danger. You imagine both scenarios and realize they require the same skills. Knowing what lasts matters more than timing. You notice how the cold slows everything. Mold grows more slowly. Insects move less. Time stretches. Underground storage buys days and weeks that would be lost above ground. This advantage alone explains why people invested so much effort below the surface. You manage waste carefully. Peels, bones, scraps. These attract animals and create smell. You store them sealed until disposal is safe. Medieval people often carried waste out under cover of darkness or buried it far from entrances. Cleanliness underground is not about comfort. It is about invisibility. You hear a faint scratch at the wall one night. A mouse. Perhaps. You respond immediately. Traps. Raised storage. Smooth surfaces rodents cannot climb easily. Evidence from excavations shows gnaw marks on containers where precautions failed. Those marks tell stories of hunger on both sides of the wall. You keep water separate from food. Clay jugs sealed tightly. Elevated. Away from damp zones. Water spills ruin more than thirst. They destroy stores and invite rot. You check lids constantly. A lesser-known observation from certain regions shows that people sometimes fermented food underground. Vegetables packed in brine. Grains turned into sour mash. Fermentation thrives in cool, stable environments. It preserves nutrition and adds variety when options are few. You imagine the rhythm of eating here. Smaller meals. Slower chewing. Less waste. Underground life teaches moderation. You eat to sustain, not to fill. You plan for lightless preparation. Cutting roots by feel. Measuring grain by hand. You do not rely on sight alone. Darkness shapes habits. Some scholars suggest that underground food storage influenced later cellar designs in medieval houses. Thick walls. Cool temperatures. Separate zones for different foods, whether borrowed or rediscovered. The principles align. You rest your hand on a container and feel reassurance. Food means time. Time means safety. The shelter is no longer just a place to hide. It is a place to endure. You adjust the arrangement one last time. Grain central. Roots peripheral. Meat high and sealed. Herbs scattered. Waste isolated. Everything has a place. Disorder invites hunger faster than scarcity. You sit back and breathe slowly. The air remains steady. The walls hold. The food waits quietly. This is the moment when preparation replaces anxiety. And as you listen to the muted world above, you understand that medieval underground survival depended not on eating well, but on eating wisely. Food was not comfort. It was patience made edible. You notice the animals before you see them. A warmth that does not come from fire. A smell that is not earth or smoke. A faint rustle that moves differently from air or settling soil. Underground. Animals are not visitors. They are companions. Invited or not. You understand quickly why medieval people did not always separate themselves completely from animals below ground. Animals bring risk. But they also bring heat, sound, and warning. A quiet shelter can feel safe. but a shelter with living creatures feels alive. You imagine bringing a goat down first. Not permanently. Not casually. Just during the coldest nights or the most dangerous hours. Its body heat shifts the air slightly warmer. Its breathing adds moisture. But also movement. You learn to balance this. There is strong evidence that small livestock were sometimes sheltered in earth-covered spaces during winter, not always in the same chamber as people, but close enough to share warmth through walls or partitions. Earth does not block heat easily when spaces touch. You build a low divider using wood and woven branches. It separates you from the animal without isolating it. This reduces mess while preserving warmth. Medieval underground spaces often show signs of internal partitioning, suggesting thoughtful coexistence rather than chaos. You listen to the animal move. Hooves scrape softly. A shift of weight. These sounds become part of the shelter's rhythm. They are comforting, but also useful. Animals react to sounds before humans do. A sudden stillness from them means attention is needed. You think about chickens next. They are smaller, quieter at night, and useful beyond warmth. Eggs matter. Feathers matter. Even droppings, unpleasant as they are, can be managed. You place them in a raised enclosure near a vent, where smell disperses more easily. Some excavated shelters contain traces of straw packed thickly in corners that show no signs of sleeping humans. This suggests animals rested there. Straw insulates bodies and absorbs waste. You replace it often. Knowing neglect breeds sickness. You manage smell carefully. Animals smell stronger underground. You scatter ash and dried herbs to absorb and mask odor. This practice appears repeatedly in medieval waste management. Above and below ground, smell is as revealing as sound. You keep animals calm. Panic spreads quickly in enclosed spaces. Sudden noise draws attention and creates danger. You learn to move slowly around them, to touch them gently, to speak softly if you must speak at all. You notice how animals adapt to darkness faster than you do. Their movements become confident. They learn the boundaries by touch and memory. Watching them teaches you how to navigate better yourself. There is disagreement about how often animals were kept fully underground for extended periods. Some researchers believe this was rare due to hygiene risks. Others point to evidence of repeated use, especially during extreme winters. The truth likely varied by region, season, and necessity. You think about rodents now. Mice and rats do not need invitations. They follow food. You respond with vigilance rather than anger. Raised storage. Smooth containers. Traps placed where movement is likely. Medieval shelters often show signs of rodent activity, but also of ongoing effort to control it. You learn the difference between helpful and harmful presence. A cat, if you have one, becomes invaluable. Quiet. Warm. Alert. It reduces rodents and adds a steady heartbeat to the space. You imagine it curled near your feet, absorbing and offering warmth without effort. You notice how animals change your own behavior. You become more attentive, more patient. You wake more easily. Their needs anchor you to routine. Underground. Routine preserves sanity. You plan for waste. Animal waste cannot accumulate. You remove it regularly, sealing it in containers until disposal is safe. Some medieval shelters appear to have dedicated waste pits away from living areas. Not elegant, but effective. You consider disease. Close quarters increase risk. You watch for signs of illness, lethargy, coughing, changes in behavior. Animals often show sickness before humans feel it. They become early indicators. A curious detail appears in a few accounts where people used animals as timing tools. When animals grew restless at dawn, it signaled safe moments to emerge. Their internal rhythms remained aligned with the outside world even underground. You feel the shelter change with their presence. Warmer, louder, messier, but also less lonely. Medieval life valued community, even in hiding. Complete isolation was rare and often damaging. You adjust the ventilation slightly, compensating for additional breath. Airflow increases just enough to keep the space fresh. You check it often. Animals cannot tell you when air grows thin. You must notice first. You lie back and listen to the layered sounds. You're breathing. The animal's breathing. The earth settling. This chorus becomes familiar. It signals normalcy. Some scholars suggest that living with animals underground influenced medieval attitudes towards space and cleanliness. The line between human and animal living areas was more flexible than modern expectations. Underground shelters highlight this intimacy. You imagine a long night passing. Outside, danger moves. Inside, life continues. An animal shifts. You shift. Heat circulates. Time stretches. You realize that animals underground are not simply tools. They are participants. Their survival is tied to yours. Caring for them gives structure to waiting. You adjust straw bedding once more, keeping it dry. You stroke a warm flank. The animal responds with calm acceptance. This exchange feels ancient and familiar. As you settle back into the dim light, you understand that medieval underground shelters were not silent tombs. They were shared spaces, human and animal breath mixing quietly in the dark. And as the hours pass, you learn that survival below ground is not just about hiding. It is about sustaining life in all its forms, patiently and together. You learn silence by listening to it fail. Underground, quiet is not the absence of sound. It is control. You sit still and notice how even the smallest movement changes the air. Fabric brushes skin. A knee shifts against packed earth. A breath deepens at the wrong moment. Each sound feels louder than it truly is, magnified by your own attention. Above you, the world moves on without knowing you are here. That is the goal. Medieval people did not expect perfect invisibility. They aimed for ordinary. Ordinary sounds do not invite curiosity. Extraordinary ones do. You train yourself to pause before every action, not from fear, but from habit. Move. Stop. Listen. This rhythm becomes second nature. Children learn it early. Adults relearn it quickly. Silence is not natural. It is practiced. You imagine footsteps passing overhead. At first they freeze you. Then you learn to read them. The weight, the pace, the number. One person walks differently from a group. Soldiers move differently from farmers. Animals move differently from both. Sound carries information if you let it. There is strong agreement among historians that people hiding underground relied heavily on sound to assess danger. Sight was limited. Smell was unreliable. Sound traveled through soil and wood with surprising clarity. You experience this now as a faint vibration under your hand when someone walks above. You flatten your palm against the wall and feel it. The earth transmits rhythm. Fast steps suggest urgency. Slow steps suggest caution. Pauses matter most. A pause means attention. A pause is when you hold your breath. You signal others with a touch rather than a word. A squeeze of the hand. A tap on the knee. Communication becomes physical and minimal. Underground. Language shrinks to essentials. You do not explain. You indicate. You think about animals again. Their reactions matter. A sudden stillness from them warns you. A shift toward the wall suggests vibration. You trust them more than your own instincts at times. They do not overthink. You manage sound proactively. Loose items are tied down. Containers padded with cloth. Tools placed carefully. Nothing is left to roll or clatter. Medieval underground shelters often show signs of deliberate sound dampening. Not in materials, but in arrangement. You lower your voice to a whisper only when absolutely necessary. Often you choose not to speak at all. Silence communicates safety. Speech invites mistakes. There is a revealing detail in some medieval accounts describing people holding their breath during moments of danger. Not for long, but enough to reduce sound. Breathing quietly becomes an art. Slow inhalation through the nose. Controlled release through barely parted lips. You notice how fear changes breathing automatically. It speeds up. It grows shallow. You counter this by focusing on rhythm. In, out, counted. This calms both body and sound. You listen for more than footsteps. Metal carries a distinct tone. Armor scrapes. Weapons knock. Tools jingle. These sounds suggest different intentions. Not everyone above means harm. But you treat uncertainty the same way, with patience. There is disagreement among scholars about how often underground shelters were discovered by sound alone. Some argue that discovery usually came from informants or visible traces. Others point out that quietness was mentioned repeatedly in oral traditions as essential. The truth likely varies by circumstance. You learn to distinguish danger from passing life. A wagon rumbling by shakes the ground but moves on. A conversation drifts and fades. These moments teach restraint. You do not react to everything. You wait for patterns. Waiting is harder than hiding. Muscles ache. Thoughts race. You want to move. You resist. Medieval people developed endurance not only of body, but of stillness. Silence demands patience more than strength. You imagine children learning this lesson, taught through games at first. Hide and wait. Do not move until called. Later, the game becomes real. The rules remain. You manage coughing carefully. A cough is dangerous. You suppress it when possible. Sip water slowly. Press cloth to mouth. Medieval remedies for cough appear frequently in household advice, likely because noise was as much a concern as comfort. You notice how silence changes your perception of time. Seconds stretch. Minutes feel heavy. Without sound, there is nothing to mark progress. This can unsteady the mind. You counter it by focusing on breathing or touch. You keep hands busy quietly. Twisting cord. Smoothing straw. Simple tasks ground you. Stillness does not mean inactivity. It means controlled movement. There is a curious pattern in some underground shelters, where wear marks appear in limited areas rather than spread evenly. This suggests people confined movement deliberately, staying in known quiet zones. You choose such a spot now. You feel the earth above settle as someone steps away. The vibration fades. Silence returns. This is the moment you wait for, the return of normal. You do not celebrate it. You acknowledge it quietly. You remain still longer than feels necessary. Danger rarely ends the moment sound fades. Patience extends safety. You count breaths rather than minutes. Some scholars suggest that the psychological strain of silence was one of the greatest challenges of underground hiding. Others argue that routine softened the impact. You believe both. The first nights are hardest. Familiarity helps. You listen again. Nothing. Or rather, nothing unusual. The shelter breathes. Animals shift softly. Air moves through vents. These sounds become background. They are safe. You allow yourself to move slightly now. Adjust posture. Stretch carefully. Silence has phases. Absolute stillness during threat. Controlled movement afterward. You follow this rhythm instinctively now. You reflect on how silence shapes trust. Everyone must cooperate. One mistake endangers all. Underground life reinforces communal responsibility without words. As the hours pass and danger remains above, you learn to rest inside quiet. Silence stops being an enemy. It becomes a shield you hold together. And when you finally hear the world above resume its ordinary patterns, you understand that medieval survival below ground depended not on being invisible, but on sounding uninteresting enough to be ignored. You begin to understand that hiding underground is not always about fear in the moment. Sometimes it is about preparation for something longer and heavier. War does not always arrive quickly and leave just as fast. Sometimes it settles in like winter, grinding forward day by day. When that happens, disappearing beneath the ground becomes a strategy rather than a reaction. You imagine the distant sounds of conflict drifting across the land. Not shouting, not battle cries, but the quieter signs. Fields left unworked, roads unusually empty, smoke rising where it should not. Medieval people learned to read these signs early. When they appeared together, it meant trouble was not passing through. It was coming to stay. There is firm historical evidence that underground shelters were used during sieges and prolonged military campaigns. especially in regions without strong fortifications, villages near contested borders, trade routes, or rebellious territories relied on concealment rather than defense. When armies moved through, they took what they could see. What they could not see often survived. You picture yourself retreating below ground not for hours, but for days. The shelter changes when you think in these terms. Food storage matters more. Ventilation must be reliable. Waste management becomes critical. Every system you built earlier now proves its worth. You listen carefully to the sounds above. During war, they are different. Not random. Organized. Boots in rhythm. Voices carrying authority. Animals driven rather than wandering. These sounds tell you not only that danger exists, but that it has structure. You recognize this as one of the most dangerous times. Organized forces search more thoroughly than raiders. They know people hide. They look for signs. Silence becomes even more important. So does patience. Accounts from medieval chronicles describe villages that appeared abandoned during military campaigns, only to repopulate once armies moved on. While these sources rarely describe underground shelters directly, the pattern suggests concealment on a large scale. People did not vanish by chance. They planned. You imagine the tension of waiting while soldiers camp nearby. Fires crackle. Metal clinks. Orders are shouted. Every sound presses down through the earth. You resist the urge to react. Movement now would betray you. You rely on the shelter to do what it was built to do. Walls hold. Air moves. Food waits. Time stretches. You count days by hunger and rest rather than light. There is a persistent idea among historians that underground shelters were especially valuable during scorched earth tactics. When armies destroyed crops and homes to deny resources, hiding underground protected not only people, but supplies. When the land above was stripped bare, what remained hidden became the seed of recovery. You feel the psychological strain of this kind of waiting. Short hiding is sharp and frightening. Long hiding is dull and exhausting. The mind wanders. Doubt creeps in. You counter it with routine. Checking vents, rearranging stores, cleaning quietly. Routine becomes a form of resistance. You notice how the shelter muffles distant explosions or collapsing structures. Earth absorbs shock. Sounds that would terrify above ground become muted thumps below. This physical buffering also softens emotional impact. You are aware of danger without being overwhelmed by it. There is debate about how often underground shelters were used offensively rather than defensively. Some scholars suggest they served as bases for surprise attacks or escapes. Others argue their primary value was endurance, not action. Sitting here, you understand why endurance mattered more. Survival was victory enough. You imagine emerging briefly at night to gather information or supplies. These moments are calculated, quick, quiet. The shelter remains your anchor. You always return before dawn. Above ground is temporary. Below ground is home for now. You listen for changes in sound patterns. Camps that grow quieter may signal departure. Increased movement may signal preparation. You learn to read these shifts without seeing them. Sound becomes your window to the outside world. There is a small but telling detail in some medieval narratives, where people describe knowing an army had left, not by sight, but by silence. The sudden absence of noise felt unnatural at first. Only later did relief arrive. You imagine that moment now. You manage morale underground. Fear spreads quickly in enclosed spaces. You keep voices low but calm. You share food evenly. You remind yourself and others that waiting is working. Panic solves nothing. You think about children again. Long hiding tests them differently. They grow restless. They ask questions. You answer softly. Honestly. Without detail that fuels fear. Medieval families depended on trust and reassurance more than explanation. You monitor the shelter closely during extended stays. Moisture builds. Air shifts. You adjust as needed. War does not pause for maintenance. But neglect shortens survival. You do what you can with what you have. Some researchers argue that underground shelters influenced patterns of medieval settlement. encouraging dispersal rather than concentration. Smaller communities could hide more effectively. Larger ones drew attention, whether intentional or not. The landscape reflects this logic. You imagine the first tentative emergence after days or weeks below. You do not rush. You listen. You test the air. You lift the entrance, covering only slightly. Light spills in, harsh and unfamiliar. You blink and wait. Above ground, the world looks changed. Tracks in the soil, broken fences, empty spaces where homes stood. The shelter did its job. It preserved life. Not property. That distinction matters. You understand now why underground shelters were rarely spoken of openly. Admitting their existence weakened their value. Secrecy extended beyond use. It became cultural habit. As you settle back underground one last time, waiting for full certainty before leaving, you feel the weight of history in the soil around you. Countless others waited like this. Quietly, patiently, determined to outlast forces larger than themselves. And in that waiting, beneath layers of earth and time, medieval survival proved that endurance, not confrontation, was often the strongest response to war. You begin to notice something subtle as the days underground pass. Not everyone uses this hidden space the same way. The shelter itself may look similar from the outside, but the reasons people come here, and how they behave once inside, can differ quietly and profoundly. You imagine a peasant first, someone whose life above ground revolves around fields, seasons, and obligations that cannot be refused. For them, the dugout is insurance, a place to protect grain from collectors, a place to protect children from raiders, a place to protect the body when winter sharpens its teeth. Their movements underground are practical. They count food, they check walls. They plan for return, not escape. There is ample evidence that rural peasants relied on hidden spaces to preserve surplus beyond what lords expected to see. Grain concealed underground could mean the difference between hunger and survival. This practice appears indirectly in tax records that do not align with actual population survival rates. People lived on something that was not officially there. You picture a monk next, not in a grand abbey, but in a remote religious house or hermitage. For them, the underground space feels different, less about hiding from violence, more about separation. Silence already shapes their days. Darkness already carries meaning. Underground rooms become places of contemplation as much as refuge. Some monastic sites show evidence of sunken rooms used for prayer, storage, or isolation. These spaces were not secret in the same way peasant shelters were, but they shared techniques: earth insulation, low light, stillness. The underground offered withdrawal from the world without complete disappearance. You imagine how a monk moves here. Slowly, deliberately, less concerned with noise, more with ritual. The shelter holds a different emotional weight. Not fear, but discipline. Then there are outlaws, people who cannot safely remain visible, debt fugitives, bandits, rebels. Their relationship with underground spaces is the most complex. For them, hiding is not temporary. It is a way of life. You picture someone living close to the margins of the law, using the shelter as a base. They move in and out often. They prioritize entrances and exits. They keep supplies light and portable. They care less about comfort and more about speed. There are scattered accounts and local legends describing bandits vanishing into hillsides or forests, pursued and then lost. Archaeology rarely confirms these stories directly, but certain underground structures far from settled areas suggest prolonged use by people avoiding society rather than protecting it. You feel the difference in how such a person would arrange the space. Less order, more readiness. Food packed for movement, bedding minimal. Tools near the entrance. The shelter feels tense, even when empty. There is ongoing discussion among scholars about whether these underground spaces served specific social groups or whether they were shared across communities as needed. The evidence suggests flexibility. A peasant shelter one season could become an outlaw refuge another. The earth does not care who uses it. You imagine moments when these worlds overlap. A monk offering shelter to villagers during conflict. A peasant quietly aiding someone hiding from authority. Underground spaces blur social boundaries. Titles matter less when everyone breathes the same air in the dark. You notice how behavior adapts. Peasants focus on group survival. Monks focus on inner discipline. Outlaws focus on awareness and escape. The shelter accommodates all three. But it does not change them. It reveals them. You think about children growing up in these spaces. A peasant child learns patience and obedience. A monastic novice learns silence and reflection. An outlaw child learns alertness and caution. The same walls shape different instincts. There is a small but telling detail found in some shelters where objects associated with very different lives appear together. Farming tools beside religious tokens. Weapons beside cooking vessels. These combinations suggest shared use or sequential occupation rather than clear ownership. You imagine discovering such a space centuries later. The confusion. The temptation to assign a single purpose. In reality, the shelter lived many lives, just like the people who used it. You consider how each group leaves traces. Peasants leave storage pits and worn sleeping areas. Monks leave symbols, candles, and carefully placed objects. Outlaws leave fewer traces by intention. What they leave behind is accidental and scattered. There is disagreement about whether underground shelters encouraged resistance against authority or simply allowed people to endure it. Some argue that hiding resources weakened control systems. Others see it as a survival tactic without political intent. Sitting here, you feel how survival often comes before ideology. You reflect on trust. Allowing someone else into your shelter is a serious decision. Peasants trust neighbors reluctantly. Monks trust through shared belief. Outlaws trust sparingly, if at all. Underground. Trust becomes physical. One betrayal ends everything. You imagine the tension when different groups share the space. Unease. Careful observation. Negotiated silence. Yet necessity overrides discomfort. The shelter demands cooperation or offers nothing. You begin to see the dugout not as a single type of place, but as a tool. A neutral container shaped by whoever occupies it. Earth shelters are democratic in that way. They give nothing extra. They simply protect what is placed inside. Some scholars suggest that underground shelters played a role in preserving local knowledge during times of upheaval. When written records were destroyed, people survived and remembered. Oral traditions passed quietly from these hidden spaces back into the open world. You imagine stories told softly underground. Not heroic tales, but instructions. How to dig, where to hide, what to listen for. Knowledge shaped by use rather than theory. You settle into the space again and feel how adaptable it is. It does not judge your purpose. It does not demand explanation. It holds peasants, monks, and outlaws alike. And as you sit there, surrounded by earth and silence, you understand that medieval underground shelters were not just places of hiding. They were crossroads where different lives briefly met, equalized by darkness, bound together by the simple need to endure. Life underground settles into rhythm faster than you expect. Once the fear dulls and the novelty fades, what remains is routine. Medieval people did not survive by constantly reacting. They survived by repeating small, careful actions until those actions became normal. You wake without light. There is no dawn here, no gradual brightening. Instead, you wake when your body is ready or when sound above tells you it is time. You stretch slowly, mindful of the low ceiling, and sit up without speaking. Morning underground begins in silence. You start by checking the shelter. Hands move along walls, feeling for softness or moisture. You glance at supports, counting them without thinking. You test the air with a breath and a pause. Everything that matters can be sensed quickly if you know what to look for. This pattern appears consistently in accounts of enclosed medieval living. Daily checks were not formal inspections. They were habits woven into waking. A wall touched, A vent cleared, a covering adjusted. These actions kept people alive long before danger announced itself. You prepare food quietly. Grain measured by hand. Roots cleaned without splashing. You eat slowly, conserving supplies and sound. Meals underground are smaller, but more deliberate. Eating becomes an act of maintenance rather than pleasure. You notice how time stretches. Without daylight, hours blur. Medieval people underground often structured their day around tasks rather than clocks. When tasks were complete, rest followed. When hunger returned, so did work. The body became the calendar. You occupy your hands constantly, repairing clothing, twisting cord, sharpening tools gently. These tasks keep you useful and calm. Idleness invites anxiety. Movement, even minimal, gives shape to waiting. You rest in intervals rather than long sleep. Short periods of dozing allow you to respond quickly if needed. Underground rest is light and attentive. You learn to wake at small changes in sound or air. You manage waste carefully each day. Containers sealed. Materials moved to designated areas. Cleanliness here is not comfort. It is survival. Medieval underground spaces show signs of repeated cleaning rather than abandonment, suggesting people treated maintenance as daily duty. You teach children quietly. Lessons are practical. How to move without sound. How to feel the wall before stepping. How to breathe slowly. Learning underground is not abstract. It is immediate and embodied. You notice how emotions change. Fear fades into alertness. Boredom creeps in. You counter it with routine. Routine steadies the mind. Medieval survival depended as much on mental endurance as physical strength. There is evidence from some underground shelters that people marked days using scratches, knots, or small piles of objects. Not everyone did this, but it suggests a need to track time during longer stays. You consider doing the same, then decide against it. Counting days can make waiting heavier. You listen for familiar sounds above. The return of birds, the rhythm of ordinary footsteps. These signals tell you more than sight ever could. You learn which sounds mean safety and which demand continued hiding. You adjust your body to the space. Knees bend differently. Movements shrink. Posture adapts. Underground living reshapes how you carry yourself. Medieval bodies were already accustomed to labor. They adapted quickly to confinement. You think about prayer, reflection, or quiet thought. Some people fill time with these. Others focus on practical tasks. Both approaches appear in underground contexts. The shelter does not dictate how you cope. It only limits distractions. You share space carefully. People take turns resting. Voices remain low. Disagreements are postponed rather than resolved. Conflict underground threatens survival. Medieval communities learned restraint through necessity. You check food stores again, not because you forgot, but because repetition reassures. Supplies feel more secure when confirmed regularly. You adjust portions based on expected duration, even if that duration remains unknown. You feel the absence of sky most sharply during moments of rest. The mind drifts upward, imagining open space. You acknowledge the feeling, then return to what is present. Longing serves no purpose here. You notice how quickly the shelter becomes familiar. The darkness stops feeling heavy. The walls feel known. This familiarity reduces stress. Unknown spaces frighten. Known ones comfort, even when confined. Some scholars suggest that daily underground routines influenced later monastic schedules and domestic habits. The emphasis on repetition, silence, and order appears in multiple medieval contexts. Whether connected or coincidental, the parallels are striking. You keep tools ready but not scattered. Order matters. Searching in the dark wastes time and creates noise. Every object returns to its place after use. You sense when it is time to prepare for emergence, not by sight, but by sound patterns and instinct. The shelter teaches patience, but it also teaches when waiting has done its work. You sit quietly one more time. breathing slow, hands resting on packed earth. Life underground is not dramatic. It is measured, careful, endlessly repetitive. And in that repetition, medieval people found a way to endure uncertainty without being consumed by it. Routine became their anchor. Beneath the ground, doing the same small things each day kept the larger world at bay. Smell reaches you before sound ever does. Underground, scent travels differently. It lingers. It settles into fabric, straw, skin, and earth. Medieval people understood this instinctively. A shelter that cannot hide its smell is not hidden at all. You breathe in slowly and catalogue what you sense. Earth, oil, straw, animal warmth. These are acceptable, familiar. Anything sharp, sour, or unexpected demands attention. Smell is an early warning system that never sleeps. You begin by managing smoke, because smoke tells stories you do not want told. Even a small flame produces it. You keep fires low and infrequent, feeding them slowly rather than all at once. You watch how smoke behaves, how it thins, how it disappears. When it does not, you change something immediately. There is clear evidence that medieval underground shelters rarely used continuous fires. Soot patterns show short, controlled burning rather than constant heat. This suggests people waited, endured cold, and only burned fuel when absolutely necessary. Smoke was treated as a risk, not a comfort. You position lamps carefully, never directly beneath vents, never near entrances. Light must stay low and steady. Flickering flames create movement that attracts attention. A calm flame blends into the space. You pay close attention to cooking smells. Boiling grain releases scent. Roasting meat announces itself loudly through air. You choose foods that require minimal preparation underground. When cooking cannot be avoided, you time it carefully, choosing moments when wind direction and ambient smells outside offer cover. You imagine rain above ground. Wet earth carries scent differently. Strong smells dissipate faster. Medieval people often waited for bad weather to cook or heat underground, knowing the environment itself would help hide them. You manage waste with even greater care. Human and animal waste produces strong odors quickly. Containers must be sealed. Absorbent materials replaced. Ash scattered. Neglect here invites discovery faster than noise ever could. You notice how certain materials help. Charcoal absorbs scent. Ash neutralizes moisture. Dried herbs mask unpleasant odors. These substances appear repeatedly in medieval household contexts, suggesting people understood their effects long before chemistry named them. You rub a handful of ash between your palms and scatter it lightly in a corner. The smell softens almost immediately. Simple actions have powerful results underground. You think about bodies. Sweat accumulates. Damp clothing smells. You dry garments when possible, hanging them near vents without blocking airflow. You change straw bedding frequently. Cleanliness here is not about appearance. It is about invisibility. There is disagreement among scholars about how often underground shelters were compromised by smell. Some argue scent alone rarely led to discovery. Others point to hunting dogs and animals trained to track humans. The presence of such animals changes everything. What seems faint to you may be obvious to them. You plan for this possibility. You avoid leaving scent trails near entrances. You scatter waste far away. You mask the smell of disturbed earth with natural debris. Medieval people lived close to animals. They knew how keen noses could be. You notice how animals underground contribute to smell. Useful for warmth. Dangerous for secrecy. You manage their bedding carefully. You move waste promptly. You adjust ventilation to balance air quality with concealment. You listen to your own body again. Stress increases sweat. Fear smells sharp. Calm smells neutral. You focus on breathing slowly, keeping your body cool. Emotional control becomes part of scent control. You imagine someone passing overhead with dogs. The dogs sniff the ground. Pause. Move on. The shelter holds. Not because it is perfect, but because you have minimized every clue. There is a curious detail in some medieval narratives where people mention rubbing themselves with earth or plant matter before hiding. This may have helped mask human scent. Whether widespread or not, the idea reveals how deeply people thought about smell as a threat. You keep food sealed tightly. Grain attracts insects. Insects attract predators. The chain begins with smell. Breaking it early matters. You check vents regularly. Stagnant air traps scent. Gentle movement carries it away. Ventilation serves multiple purposes at once. You become aware of how smell affects your mood. Stale air breeds discomfort. Freshness, even underground, calms the mind. You maintain airflow not just for lungs, but for sanity. You imagine emerging after days below. Fresh air would feel overwhelming at first. Underground smell becomes familiar quickly. The outside world would feel sharp and exposed. You think about how smell ties memory to place. Underground shelters were remembered not just by shape, but by scent, earth, straw, smoke. These smells linger in memory long after the space is abandoned. Some scholars suggest that scent management influenced where people built underground shelters. Areas with naturally strong smells, such as near livestock or water, provided cover. Whether intentional or convenient, the effect would have been useful. You adjust a vent again. Just slightly. The air shifts. The space feels lighter. Smell softens. Balance restored. You settle back and breathe deeply, confident that nothing you carry announces your presence. Silence hides sound. Darkness hides light. Care hides scent. And as you sit quietly, wrapped in earth and patience, you understand that medieval underground survival depended not only on what others could not see or hear, but on what they could not smell. The most dangerous clues were often the ones no one noticed until it was too late. Life does not pause just because the world above becomes dangerous. Underground. Time keeps moving forward, quietly and without ceremony. You realize this most clearly when you think about children. Not children hiding for a night or two, but children arriving here, taking their first breath surrounded by earth instead of sky. You imagine the space differently now. Softer, more careful. Corners padded. Movements slower. The shelter is no longer just a place to endure danger. It becomes a place where life begins. There is solid evidence that medieval people sometimes gave birth in enclosed or hidden spaces during periods of unrest. This was not ideal, but it was necessary. Travel was dangerous. Exposure invited discovery. When the time came, the shelter had to be enough. You picture the tension of that moment. Pain managed quietly. Voices kept low. Breath controlled. Underground birth demanded calm under pressure. Panic risked sound. Sound risked everything. You prepare the space differently. Straw laid thick. Clean cloth set aside carefully. Water kept ready. Heat managed gently. Medieval birth practices relied heavily on experience rather than written instruction. Knowledge passed from one woman to another, whispered and remembered. You feel how the shelter's steady temperature helps. No biting cold. No harsh wind. The earth buffers extremes. This stability mattered more than comfort. A child born here begins life in a controlled environment. Even if it feels confined. You think about light. A small lamp turned low. Enough to see. Not enough to attract attention. Shadows dance softly on the walls. The darkness does not frighten you now. It feels protective. There is an often overlooked detail in medieval household records where births are mentioned without location, during times when homes were known to be unsafe. This absence suggests events occurred somewhere unrecorded. Hidden spaces fill that silence. You imagine the sound of a newborn cry. Brief, urgent, dangerous. You prepare for this. Cloth to muffle sound. Gentle pressure. Calm voices. Medieval midwives were skilled at managing these moments. Silence was part of care. You feel the weight of responsibility in that first cry. A new life announces itself instinctively. Unaware of risk. You act quickly, not harshly. guiding the sound down rather than stopping it entirely. Life must breathe. You balance necessity with secrecy. You notice how the shelter feels different after. Warmer, fuller, more fragile. A baby changes priorities. Food planning shifts. Ventilation matters more. Cleanliness becomes critical. Underground survival becomes more complex, not less. You think about feeding. Breastfeeding is quiet and practical. It requires no tools. Medieval people understood its importance deeply. It sustained infants when other food sources were uncertain. Underground, it becomes essential. You manage waste carefully. Infant waste smells quickly. You respond immediately. Clean cloth replaced. Ash and herbs used. The shelter adapts again. There is discussion among scholars about how common underground births truly were. Some argue they were rare and exceptional. Others suggest they occurred more often than records reveal. Hidden by necessity. You feel how easily such moments could disappear from history. You imagine the child growing here, at least for a while, eyes adjusting to low light, hands learning the walls, sounds becoming familiar. The underground becomes normal before the outside world ever is. You think about naming, ceremonies postponed or altered, quiet blessings instead of public celebration. Medieval life adapted rituals to circumstance. Meaning did not vanish. It condensed. You notice how adults behave differently around a newborn underground. Movements become gentler, voices softer, patience deepens. The shelter becomes not just a refuge from danger, but a space of shared purpose. You worry about illness. Infants are vulnerable. Dampness and cold threaten them more than adults. You adjust bedding. Increase warmth slightly. Monitor air carefully. The margin for error narrows. You remember that medieval people often lived close to loss. Infant mortality was high even above ground. Underground did not guarantee safety. It offered possibility. Sometimes that was enough. You imagine the child's first memory being darkness and warmth rather than open sky. There is no evidence this harmed development. Humans adapt. The body learns what it is given. You consider the moment when the child is carried above ground for the first time. Light feels sharp. Air feels wide. Sound feels overwhelming. The world expands suddenly. The underground becomes a memory rather than a home. There is a quiet strength in knowing life continued even here. Not heroically. Not defiantly. Simply because stopping was not an option. You realize something important. Underground shelters were not only places of fear and waiting. They were places where life insisted on moving forward. Birth did not wait for peace. You sit quietly and imagine generations linked by these moments. A grandmother born underground during war. A mother hiding underground during famine. A child carried out into a changed world. Some historians suggest that these hidden beginnings shaped family stories, passed down long after danger faded. Not written. Remembered. The earth itself became part of lineage. You feel the shelter differently now. Less like a hole, more like a womb. Temporary, protective, necessary. You breathe slowly and let that idea settle. Medieval underground life was not only about survival, it was about continuity. Even in darkness, even in silence. Life found space to begin. And as you rest there, surrounded by earth that has held both fear and first breath, you understand that one of the quietest acts of defiance in the medieval world was simply allowing life to continue. Even below the ground. You feel the weight of stories as you sit quietly underground. Shadows cling to corners, and the walls seem to remember more than you could ever imagine. Here, whispers of superstition and belief linger just as strongly as the practical lessons of survival. Medieval people brought fear and wonder with them into these spaces, often blending caution with ritual. You imagine the hushed voices sharing tales of spirits, of ghosts inhabiting forests or hillsides above, of unseen watchers in the earth. Not everyone believed. Some treated such stories as warnings. Others treated them as truths. Either way, superstition shaped behavior. It guided where to dig, when to move, and how to act in moments of tension. There is clear evidence from folklore and surviving accounts that people often incorporated symbolic protections into underground shelters. Charms, amulets, crosses carved into walls, herbs hung to ward off evil. These objects were not purely decorative. They served as mental buffers against fear, helping those inside maintain focus and composure. You consider how superstition affects you now. Even imagined spirits demand awareness. You move carefully, listen intently, and handle objects with intention. You acknowledge their presence without surrendering to panic. The boundary between practical caution and belief is thin, but it matters. You notice how stories travel underground. A whispered warning in one shelter could appear in another village months later. Oral transmission carries lessons about what works and what fails. Medieval people learned from each other in ways that did not require writing or formal instruction. Knowledge spread quietly, often without attribution. An unusual observation from excavated sites shows small alcoves in some shelters that seem to have held talismans or charms. These were deliberately positioned near entrances or sleeping areas. They offered comfort, focus, and a sense of protection, even if the objects themselves held no physical power. They shaped behavior in measurable ways. You imagine someone waiting here during a storm, perhaps fearful of the world above and below, drawing strength from such tokens. A simple object in a dark space can shift attention from panic to action. You find yourself reaching for a small stone or piece of cloth, not as a charm, but as a focus, mirroring ancient practices instinctively. You notice the patterns of superstition are not uniform. One region emphasizes protective herbs, another, carved symbols, yet another, small rituals performed at intervals. These differences reflect local experience and belief rather than rigid doctrine. Medieval underground life was shaped as much by place and memory as by formal guidance. You think about how superstition interacts with human psychology. Fear of spirits or curses encourages caution. Checking the walls, monitoring vents, handling fire carefully, these practical habits are reinforced by imagined consequences. It is difficult to disentangle psychology from folklore. Both serve survival. You imagine the influence on children. Tales of unseen watchers teach them stillness and attentiveness. Stories emphasize caution without explicit instruction. Lessons are embedded in narrative, not lecture. Children absorb them naturally, practicing behavior that improves survival. Fear becomes functional rather than paralyzing. You consider the adults. Superstitions guide decisions subtly. Not every action is dictated by belief, but belief shapes perception. A shadowed corner may hold no spirit. Yet caution grows stronger when expectation is present. Vigilance increases. Mistakes decrease. There is ongoing debate among scholars about the role of superstition in underground living. Some argue it was a mental framework for managing risk. Others see it as reflection of genuine belief, inseparable from cultural context. Likely, it was both practical and symbolic, overlapping in complex ways. You notice that superstition also encourages social cohesion. Shared rituals, repeated quietly, create common understanding. If one person sees a warning sign, others respond similarly. Coordination improves without explicit instruction. Silent agreement emerges from shared belief. You imagine the long nights underground, punctuated by whispered stories, small tokens, and quiet rituals. The shelter becomes a space where practical survival and mental resilience intertwine. You cannot separate the physical from the psychological. Both are necessary. You manage small tasks while reflecting on the stories. Straw is replaced, food checked, ventilation adjusted. Each action is guided by a combination of habit, instinct, and subtle caution reinforced by old tales. You see how medieval people internalized lessons without needing constant oversight. You think about the way memory preserves these experiences. Superstitions are passed from one generation to the next. The walls themselves, though silent, act as witnesses. They hold impressions of touch, movement, and ritual. When someone returns, they interact with this layered memory. Experience accumulates quietly, invisibly. You feel the tension between fear and endurance. It is not a contradiction. Fear motivates attentiveness. Endurance teaches calm. Together, they create a form of competence. Medieval survival required both. You feel it in your own muscles and attention now. Decades later imagined. Centuries later lived. You listen to the shelter breathe with you. Tiny movements of air, shifts of straw, the faint scratching of animals. Shadows lengthen and shrink with minimal light. All are part of the environment, part of the ritualized life underground. You move carefully within it, attentive but not paralyzed. You realize that stories, superstitions, and habits all serve the same goal. They extend survival. They structure time. They focus attention. The shelter is both physical and mental space. Its boundaries are soil and belief. Its walls both earth and narrative. And as you sit quietly, wrapped in shadows and thought, you understand that underground life was not merely about avoiding danger. It was about maintaining focus, regulating emotion, and passing knowledge, practical or symbolic, from one person to the next. The deepest lessons are rarely written. They are lived and remembered in the dark. You feel the chill more sharply today, even with the shelter prepared carefully. Dampness clings to walls and floor, seeping into clothing and hair. The underground space protects you from many dangers, but illness remains persistent and insidious. Medieval people understood that staying alive meant more than avoiding raiders or exposure. It also meant avoiding the quiet enemies that grow in damp, enclosed spaces. You begin by checking the bedding. Straw that is too damp can harbor mold or bacteria. You pat it with hands, lifting, fluffing, rearranging. Anything saturated gets replaced with dry materials set aside earlier. Medieval life above ground also contended with damp, but underground, the stakes are higher. Even small moisture can weaken health over days. You examine yourself and companions. Skin changes. Nails become brittle. Eyes slightly glassy. Small signs accumulate unnoticed until they become serious. Medieval people developed keen observation skills for health because formal medicine was limited, and a simple infection could become fatal. Awareness is as critical as food or warmth. You consider ventilation again. Stale air accelerates illness. You ensure vents remain unobstructed. You adjust covers to allow slow airflow without compromising secrecy. Air management becomes an essential part of survival strategy. It is not only for comfort, it directly affects life and death. There is substantial evidence from excavated underground sites that people paid careful attention to hygiene within these spaces. Small pits for waste, absorbent materials, separated zones for sleeping and working all reduced disease. Success relied on consistent effort, not luck. You repeat these routines methodically, knowing their importance. You prepare food with hygiene in mind. Grain is clean, stored elevated. Roots and vegetables remain in dry sand. Salted meats are wrapped and placed off the floor. Even minor contamination could spread quickly in a confined environment. Medieval survival depended on foresight and meticulous care. You check animals next. Animals provide warmth and companionship, but can also carry disease. Bedding is refreshed. Waste is isolated. Proximity is managed. You balance benefit and risk constantly. Medieval households understood this. Animals underground are partners, not threats. If managed correctly, you consider children and the vulnerable. Young bodies react quickly to damp and cold. You monitor their skin temperature, breathing, and sleep patterns. Comfort is relative. Protection is paramount. The shelter must support life in a holistic sense, not just concealment. You notice subtle sounds now. Coughs, sniffles, shifts of limbs. Each is noted. Action is measured. Intervening early matters. A warm drink, a small adjustment in bedding, a check of air all reduce risk. Medieval survival combined observation with subtle management of conditions. There is disagreement among scholars about how much medical knowledge influenced underground practices. Some argue it was purely intuitive. Others suggest folk remedies and passed-down techniques were critical. You see, both knowledge and instinct coexist here. They guide you without written instruction. You focus on maintaining movement. Stiffness worsens with damp and cold. Simple stretches, crawling along walls. Careful repositioning of bedding. These actions preserve circulation and reduce risk of infection or muscle strain. Movement is deliberate. Every motion counts. You check the storage area again. Food spoilage can contribute to illness. Moisture, pests, or mold can turn a vital resource into a hazard. You rotate supplies. Remove compromised items. And ensure everything remains dry and accessible. Medieval experience teaches vigilance. You tend small fires carefully. Smoke must remain minimal to avoid attracting attention. But warmth is essential. A low ember can heat stones that radiate gentle heat for hours. This indirect warming is safer than open flames. Controlled heat prevents cold-related illnesses while preserving secrecy. You reflect on the psychological aspect of health. Fear increases stress hormones, which compromise immunity. Maintaining calm is not luxury, it is part of staying alive. Routine, small accomplishments, quiet observation, and shared responsibility all reduce stress. Medieval survival required both body and mind to cooperate. You imagine a long period of underground confinement. Winter stretches above. Raiding parties move through territories. Resources are limited. Maintaining health becomes a full-time occupation. The shelter's design supports this through organization, cleanliness, and adaptability. You notice how smell affects perception of health. Stale air, damp bedding, or contaminated food can produce nausea or anxiety. By managing scent, you indirectly support well-being. Medieval people recognized this intuitively, using herbs, ash, and ventilation to maintain both comfort and safety. You assess the impact of illness on morale. A sick child or adult shifts attention from security to care. The shelter's occupants must respond quickly, balancing care with concealment. Medieval families likely developed protocols for this. Observation, early intervention, and quiet action prevent panic. You move slowly and deliberately, performing each task in order. Checking bedding, rotating food, adjusting vent openings, attending to animals, monitoring each individual's condition. Health management becomes a sequence of micro-actions repeated consistently. Routine sustains life as much as walls and earth. There is a small but revealing observation in medieval chronicles. They note people surviving extended periods underground with minimal food and exposure, attributing success not solely to shelter design, but to careful attention to bodily needs. Survival is practical, deliberate, and methodical. You listen to breathing, movement, subtle cues, even silence communicates. You sense whether conditions are worsening. You adjust. The shelter responds indirectly through human intervention. Subtle management of air, moisture, warmth, and nutrition. You understand that underground life is not passive. Each day requires continuous engagement. Neglect accumulates faster than danger. Medieval people survived through a combination of foresight, routine, and careful monitoring. You practice the same now, imagining their patience and attention. As you settle for rest, you feel the shelter's stability under you. Walls firm, air moving, supplies intact. Animals calm, everyone breathing steadily. Illness is not absent, but controlled. Survival persists through diligence, observation, and subtle adaptation. And as the hours pass quietly in this underground world, you realize that health, like shelter, depends on balance, not dramatic action, not heroism, but careful, measured, and constant care for body, environment, and companions. This is as essential to medieval survival as concealment itself. You begin to understand that endurance is what truly separates survival from mere existence underground. The shelter has provided walls, warmth, ventilation, food, and protection. But it cannot do the work for you. Medieval people discovered early that the longer you remain below, the more patience, observation, and discipline matter. Survival is less about reacting to threats and more about anticipating them, maintaining systems, and resisting fatigue. You sit quietly and consider how long you have been below. Hours feel like days. Days feel like weeks. Without sunlight, time stretches, and the mind begins to drift. Medieval dwellers likely experienced this too, measuring time not by clocks or shadows but by hunger, fatigue, and the rhythm of the space itself. Awareness of subtle changes becomes vital. A shift in air, a faint movement in stored food, the quiet settling of the earth. These are markers of continuity and change alike. You examine the shelter itself, noting how everything you built continues to support life. Walls hold, timber braces the ceiling, the floor remains firm, and ventilation channels allow air to move. Yet, you understand that structural integrity alone does not guarantee endurance. Human attention to detail is essential. Daily inspections, subtle adjustments, and careful monitoring prevent collapse, suffocation, or spoilage. You check food supplies next. Grain remains dry, roots are intact, and preserved meats are secure. Each container is inspected for moisture or pests. In confined spaces, small mistakes can escalate quickly. Medieval people learned through observation and repetition that maintaining order in storage is as important as the shelter itself. Even minor negligence could jeopardize survival for an entire household. You consider the behavior of animals within the space. Their presence provides warmth and comfort, but they also require care. Bedding must be refreshed, waste removed, and feeding monitored. The smallest oversight can compromise air quality or introduce disease. Underground life demands vigilance for every living creature, human and non-human alike. You shift to attending to personal health. You stretch slowly, mindful of the low ceiling. You adjust clothing and bedding to maintain warmth and dryness. You take note of any aches, chills, or fatigue. Medieval dwellers likely developed routines that balanced physical activity with rest, conserving energy while preventing illness. Each movement is measured and deliberate. You inspect the ventilation paths. Airflow remains steady but subtle. You adjust openings slightly to maintain optimal circulation without compromising concealment. This balance is critical. Insufficient airflow allows humidity and stagnation to accumulate, increasing the risk of illness. Too much airflow, and the shelter becomes cold or reveals movement through smoke or smell. The human body must actively manage the microclimate to survive. You attend to sound as well. Silence is not passive but a practice. You monitor for subtle disturbances, learning to distinguish normal creaks of the earth from approaching danger. Medieval underground dwellers likely developed acute hearing, able to detect differences in rhythm or pressure that would go unnoticed above ground. Attention to auditory cues becomes a form of early warning system. You reflect on emotional endurance. The psychological strain of confinement is as real as physical fatigue. Darkness, isolation, and monotony challenge the mind. Medieval people relied on routines, communal support, and mental discipline to endure extended stays. You practice the same strategies now, structuring tasks, pacing movement, and maintaining focus to preserve mental stability. You manage waste carefully. Human and animal waste is isolated, absorbed, or removed as necessary. Hygiene is critical, not for comfort, but for survival. Disease spreads rapidly in confined spaces, and medieval dwellers had to rely on observation, experience, and intuition to prevent outbreaks. Each small action, emptying a container, adjusting bedding, or relocating straw, contributes to the overall safety of the shelter. You revisit the storage and organization of supplies. Items are rotated and monitored to prevent spoilage. Herbs and absorbent materials are refreshed to maintain air quality and reduce odor. Medieval people understood that order and cleanliness, while not glamorous, are essential survival tools. The shelter is not merely a hiding place. It is a carefully managed system. Dependent on continuous care, you monitor companions closely, whether human or animal. Their well-being affects the stability of the shelter itself. Fatigue, illness, or agitation introduces risk. You practice subtle interventions, repositioning, warmth management, and gentle reassurance. Social cohesion and attentive care are as vital as food or structural integrity. You consider the interplay between physical, environmental, and psychological factors. Each element affects the others. Moisture influences temperature. Temperature influences comfort. Comfort influences behavior and vigilance. Behavior influences sound, waste, and energy management. Medieval survival was not about controlling each factor independently, but about maintaining balance across the system. You test yourself against monotony. Boredom can erode focus and patience, leading to mistakes. You create small tasks, checking supports, rearranging bedding, measuring food, inspecting vents, observing animals. Each task provides structure and reinforces attentiveness, training endurance in ways that may have been invisible to outsiders. You imagine the shelter as a living system. It responds to attention, neglect, and care. Human action is essential to maintain equilibrium. The earth provides stability, but humans provide resilience. Medieval dwellers understood this intuitively. The shelter is only as effective as the care invested in it. You reflect on long-term adaptation. Extended underground life requires flexibility, foresight, and skill. Food management, hygiene, ventilation, warmth, and emotional regulation all interact. Survival is cumulative, dependent on repeated correct actions, small decisions, and careful observation over days, weeks, or even months. You listen to the faint sounds above and within, the settling of earth, the subtle movement of animals, the flow of air through ventilation channels. These cues provide feedback. Adjustments are made silently, methodically, and without urgency. Medieval people relied on this ongoing attentiveness to extend endurance. You sit back, hands resting on the floor, and feel the weight of responsibility that comes with sustained survival. The shelter continues to protect, but only because it is tended. You realize that endurance is not passive. It is the sum of daily choices, repeated consistently over time. Survival depends on patience, observation, and quiet diligence. And as you settle into stillness, feeling the shelter hold you and the systems you maintain, you understand that medieval underground life was not defined by short-term fear, but by the capacity to endure through attention, adaptation, and unwavering care. You begin to notice the subtle traces left behind, the quiet evidence that people existed here long before you. Underground shelters, though hidden, preserve stories if you know how to read them. Marks on walls, depressions in the floor, scratches in timber, they are not merely physical. They are echoes of activity, of care, of survival. You run your hand along a timber post, feeling the grooves left by repeated handling. This post once supported a roof, but it also carried the weight of human intention. Every adjustment, every replacement, every inspection left a mark, however faint. Medieval people left these traces unintentionally, yet they speak volumes about daily life underground. You examine the floor, smooth patches where straw was regularly replaced, slight depressions where feet rested, children knelt, or animals shifted. These features are not deliberate design, but they reveal patterns of occupancy. Movement, care, and routine leave their mark, silently shaping the shelter for future inhabitants or future observers. You think about food storage again. Containers pressed into corners. Lids scraped against each other. Tools tucked nearby. Each placement communicates habit and expectation. Grain rotated. Herbs replenished. Meat elevated. These repeated actions form a map of human interaction with space. There is evidence from excavated sites that these small details allow archaeologists to reconstruct activity patterns. They reveal how medieval people lived within hidden environments, which areas were used most frequently, which were reserved for sleeping, how tasks were divided. Traces tell stories that words never captured. You observe minor soot stains on the wall, not from neglect, but from controlled fires used for light or warmth. Their placement suggests repeated positioning of lamps or small embers. Patterns emerge that indicate daily routines and care, rather than chance. You consider the significance of worn surfaces, smooth timber posts, compacted floors, flattened straw. Each is a record of repeated activity and of adaptation. Medieval underground dwellers understood that survival required repetition, and that repetition would leave evidence, however faint, over time. You notice small niches in the walls. Some held tools, others held objects with symbolic value. Evidence suggests these niches were maintained over generations, reused, and respected. Their continued presence hints at both practical and psychological function, providing access and reassurance. You think about the transient occupants, those who use the space briefly during raids or storms. Their traces are subtler footprints in dust, displaced straw, slight depressions. Yet even these ephemeral marks contribute to the overall narrative of human habitation. Some scholars suggest that examining these traces allows insight into communal behavior. The patterns of storage, movement, and rest indicate social structures and priorities. The distribution of tasks, attention to hygiene, and care for others can be inferred from what remains. You inspect small gaps in timber and stone. They were likely used for ventilation or observation. The placement of these gaps reflects understanding of airflow, light, and security. They are functional, but they also carry silent testimony to human ingenuity and adaptation. You imagine multiple generations using the same space, modifications made over decades, minor improvements, reinforcement of supports, adjustments of ventilation, rotation of storage. Each contribution leaves a subtle trace. The shelter becomes a cumulative record of experience. You consider the lessons embedded in these traces, practical knowledge about construction, safety, and efficiency is encoded in the shelter itself. Future occupants benefit from past efforts. Consciously or unconsciously, medieval people relied on accumulated wisdom as much as instinct. You observe areas of concentrated wear, perhaps where children played or slept, where adults worked or observed the entrance. These zones reveal priorities and routines. Repetition creates durability and structure. Patterns emerge that are invisible until carefully examined. There is a fascinating aspect in how trace evidence reflects responses to threat. Some scratches, worn edges, and reinforced posts suggest periods of heightened caution. Perhaps raiding parties were near. Perhaps winter demanded rapid adjustment. The shelter records these pressures silently, offering a glimpse of human resilience. You think about what remains unseen. Odor, microbial presence, residual moisture. Though intangible, these aspects also testify to past occupancy. They influence modern interpretation and remind you that survival is both visible and hidden, physical and ephemeral. You note that patterns of reuse are particularly instructive. Some niches repurposed, supports reinforced, storage shifted. The shelter evolves with its inhabitants, reflecting changing needs and circumstances. Medieval underground life was dynamic, responsive, and cumulative. You reflect on the continuity implied by these traces. The same shelter may have hosted peasants, monks, and fugitives over time. Each left different patterns of use. Yet the space accommodated all. The earth absorbs these differences, creating a layered history, accessible only through careful observation. You pause, letting your hand rest on a smooth timber post. The shelter feels alive, not as a static hole in the ground, but as a record of human perseverance. Each trace, each worn surface, each carefully placed object speaks silently across generations. And as you sit quietly, surrounded by these subtle histories, you understand that medieval underground life left evidence not only in documents or stories, but in the very earth itself. These traces are enduring reminders of adaptation, patience, and the quiet ingenuity required to survive in hidden spaces. You begin to feel a rhythm to life underground, a subtle cadence dictated by the space itself. The shelter, with its walls of earth and timber, guides behavior as much as any rule or instruction. Each day unfolds in quiet repetition, checking the walls, rotating food, adjusting ventilation, observing animals, tending bedding, and listening intently for any sign of change above. Survival is not passive. It is structured, deliberate, and cumulative. You notice how movement itself becomes a form of meditation, kneeling to adjust straw, moving containers carefully, stretching to reach a corner, testing the air. Each action is small, deliberate, and meaningful. Medieval people likely understood this intuitively. Underground life fosters awareness, patience, and attention to detail, because every misstep carries consequences. You consider the management of light. Flames are kept low and controlled, just enough to perform necessary tasks. Excess light could reveal movement or create shadows that betray the presence of the shelter. You test a small lamp in a niche and observe how its glow barely illuminates the surrounding area, leaving edges in shadow. Light here is functional, not decorative. You think about the impact of sound, movement, conversation, and work are all conducted with restraint. Each scrape of timber, each step on compacted earth, each whisper is measured. Silence is a constant companion, guiding behavior and sharpening awareness. Medieval dwellers knew that a misplaced sound could undo hours of careful concealment. You check food stores again. Grain, legumes, preserved meats, and root vegetables are all intact. Each container is elevated or placed strategically to reduce risk from dampness, pests, or contamination. Rotation ensures nothing remains too long. Every small decision reinforces survival. Mistakes accumulate silently in enclosed spaces, so diligence is rewarded. Medieval people applied this logic consistently, turning careful attention into habit. You reflect on the presence of animals. They provide warmth, companionship, and subtle alerts to danger, but they require careful management. Bedding is refreshed, waste removed promptly, and movement monitored. Their behavior informs your own. Underground, you learn to move in concert with other living beings. Medieval shelters that incorporated animals demonstrate the interplay between human and non-human occupants, each dependent on the other for safety and comfort. You think about ventilation once more. Fresh air is critical to maintain health, reduce humidity, and minimize odors. Openings are positioned strategically, angled to prevent direct observation while allowing airflow. Small adjustments have immediate impact on comfort and safety. Medieval people relied on experience and observation to optimize these systems, long before scientific theory could explain them. You monitor hygiene closely, personal cleanliness, as well as care of bedding, containers, and surfaces, is essential. Contamination spreads rapidly in confined spaces. Medieval accounts suggest that regular attention to these matters significantly increased survival rates. You repeat these practices methodically, internalizing them as both precaution and ritual. You consider the role of observation. Every subtle change, air, moisture, sound, or animal behavior provides information. Vigilance is not constant tension. It is routine and practiced. Medieval dwellers depended on these cues to anticipate problems before they became crises. The shelter itself becomes a tool for gathering and interpreting data. You reflect on the psychological demands of prolonged underground living. Darkness, monotony, and confinement challenge mental endurance. Structure, routine, and attention to small tasks provide stability. Children and adults alike benefit from predictable patterns and shared responsibilities. Mental resilience is cultivated through repeated, intentional engagement with the environment. You examine signs of wear and usage in the shelter. Worn patches in the floor indicate where people slept or worked. Slight grooves in timber suggest repeated handling. Minor scratches or indentations reveal patterns of movement. These traces are the silent testimony of past occupants and offer guidance for present survival. You think about the flow of time in underground life. Without light or external cues, hours blur. Awareness is maintained through the repetition of routine, monitoring, and observation. Medieval dwellers likely relied on these micro-measures rather than clocks, allowing them to structure days despite isolation from the surface world. You attend to small environmental adjustments, bedding repositioned to maintain warmth, containers shifted to reduce damp contact, straw rearranged to absorb moisture. Each intervention is minor, yet cumulatively essential. Medieval life underground relied on consistent, attentive management of both tangible and intangible risks. You consider the interplay between safety, comfort, and adaptability. The shelter protects against immediate threats but demands constant adaptation to changing conditions, shifting moisture, temperature fluctuations, varying air quality, and behavioral needs of occupants and animals. Endurance is as much about flexibility as it is about vigilance. You reflect on communal interactions. Cooperation is subtle but necessary. Shared tasks, silent communication, and coordinated care preserve both life and the structural integrity of the shelter. Medieval experience shows that social cohesion under stress was crucial for extended survival underground. You test your senses again. Air movement, faint smells, distant sounds, subtle vibrations. Each provides information about internal conditions and the external world. Attention to these signals ensures preparedness and mitigates risk. Medieval people cultivated sensory awareness as a survival skill, allowing them to detect danger without leaving the shelter. You manage stress and emotion through ritualized actions. Small, deliberate tasks occupy attention, reduce anxiety, and reinforce control over the environment. This psychological strategy complements physical precautions, creating a holistic system of endurance that sustained life over extended periods underground. You notice the way repeated tasks create efficiency, checking supplies, adjusting bedding, monitoring animals, inspecting walls and vents. Each action becomes second nature, performed with minimal thought and maximum accuracy. Medieval experience demonstrates that efficiency, cultivated through repetition, is as vital to survival as structural stability. You pause and listen, feeling the subtle rhythm of the shelter, the gentle settling of earth, the faint rustle of straw, the soft breathing of animals and humans. These sounds become a lullaby of endurance, a reminder that life continues quietly and deliberately beneath the surface. And as you reflect on these patterns of movement, observation, care, and attention, you understand that medieval underground life depended not only on the physical shelter, but on the discipline, awareness, and deliberate repetition of its occupants. Endurance, patience, and attentive practice define survival in these hidden spaces. You notice the subtle changes in air and temperature as the shelter settles through day and night. Underground life is a constant negotiation with the environment. The earth itself offers stability, yet it is never static. Shifts in moisture, slight movements in soil, and seasonal temperature variations all affect comfort and safety. Medieval people lived in intimate awareness of these patterns, adapting their behavior to maintain equilibrium. You check the floor again, feeling for dampness or soft patches. Even minor changes can signal a problem, whether it is water seeping in or structural instability. Small adjustments moving straw, shifting containers. Rotating bedding maintains safety and comfort. Repetition is key. Each day, the same actions are performed to ensure continuity. Medieval experience demonstrates that endurance is cumulative. Small, consistent interventions prevent major crises. You examine the shelter walls. Timber supports remain firm, but faint cracks appear where stress has accumulated. You tap each post lightly, listening for hollow echoes. Any change indicates the need for reinforcement. Medieval dwellers likely developed an intuitive understanding of structural integrity through repeated interaction. Without formal engineering knowledge, you adjust each support carefully, ensuring it will bear weight without compromising silence or safety. You consider ventilation. Air moves through narrow channels, carrying warmth, moisture, and the faint scents of humans and animals. Even minor obstructions can reduce airflow and increase humidity. You clear small debris, adjusting openings to optimize circulation. Medieval people relied on subtle adjustments to maintain breathable air and minimize condensation. Attention to these details often determined life or death. Food management is equally critical. You inspect containers, noting grain, legumes, dried meat, and root vegetables. Items are rotated to prevent spoilage, and spoiled portions are removed promptly. Herbs or absorbent materials help control moisture and odors. Each action preserves not only nutrition, but also the overall hygiene of the shelter. Medieval survival relied on consistent, mindful care of supplies as much as concealment or structural integrity. You observe the behavior of animals sharing the space. Their presence provides warmth and comfort. Yet they introduce additional considerations. Bedding is maintained. Waste is isolated, and movements are monitored. Animals respond to subtle cues from humans and the environment. Medieval dwellers recognized this interplay, adapting spaces to accommodate life while maintaining order. You take note of sound. Even subtle noises carry meaning. Creaks, footsteps, the faint rustle of straw, the shifting of animals all provide information about the immediate environment. You move deliberately, measuring each action against its potential acoustic impact. Silence is cultivated as a skill, refined through observation and repetition. Medieval life underground demanded this kind of auditory awareness to prevent detection and maintain calm. You reflect on the psychological demands of extended underground stays. Darkness, monotony, and confinement challenge attention and resilience. Tasks are repeated deliberately, creating structure and stability. Small achievements, like securing a food supply or reinforcing a support, reinforce confidence and mental stamina. Medieval people relied on these practices to endure uncertainty and maintain control over their surroundings. You check personal health carefully. Clothing is adjusted to maintain warmth and dryness. You stretch to prevent stiffness and maintain circulation. Small injuries are treated promptly to prevent infection. Hygiene routines, even minor ones, significantly reduce the risk of illness. Medieval underground dwellers relied on routine and vigilance to protect physical well-being in spaces where exposure, dampness, and confinement increased vulnerability. You think about light. Lamps are positioned carefully, producing minimal illumination to perform necessary tasks while avoiding detection. Light sources are limited, controlled, and monitored. The balance between visibility and concealment is delicate. Medieval experience demonstrates that managing light strategically enhances both safety and comfort. You examine waste management. Human and animal waste is isolated, absorbed, or removed. Neglecting this introduces both health risks and detectable odors. Medieval dwellers employed simple but effective strategies: containers, absorbent materials, and careful disposal to maintain hygiene without drawing attention. These practices ensure the shelter remains livable over extended periods. You review the organization of the space. Items are stored systematically, accessible yet secure. Sleeping areas are separate from work or storage zones. Patterns of movement are deliberate, Medieval experience shows that maintaining order in confined spaces reduces stress, prevents accidents, and facilitates daily routines. You observe seasonal effects. Earth responds to temperature shifts. Ventilation adjusts naturally with convection. Humidity rises or falls. The shelter demands attention to remain comfortable and safe. Medieval dwellers relied on long-term observation to anticipate these changes and adapt accordingly. You monitor the psychological environment. Routine, attention, and purpose mitigate the mental strain of confinement. Tasks provide structure. Animals offer companionship. And quiet rituals reinforce a sense of control. Mental resilience complements physical endurance, ensuring continued capacity to respond to threats. You imagine the shelter as a living system. Every component: air, light, structure, supplies, inhabitants interacts. Success depends on continuous observation, adjustment, and care. Medieval people survived underground, not through heroism but through disciplined engagement with every aspect of their environment. You reflect on the shelter's capacity to absorb human experience. Each day leaves traces in wear patterns, adjusted supports, and subtle imprints on bedding and floors. These marks accumulate across time, recording repeated decisions and adaptations. The space becomes both a refuge and a chronicle of survival. You sit quietly, listening to subtle movements. Air shifts gently. Animals breathe. The earth settles. Time passes slowly, measured by observation and repetition. Each moment is both ordinary and critical. Medieval underground life demanded attentiveness to the mundane, which ultimately ensured survival. And as you rest within these walls, you understand that endurance underground is an exercise in balance, carefully managed physical, mental, and social practices combined with vigilance and observation. Medieval people relied on this constant attentiveness as much as on walls. Timber, or concealment. You feel the culmination of all your careful work as the days underground stretch on. The shelter has held you through cold, damp, hunger, and isolation. Every action, from adjusting bedding to rotating food, from checking air to tending animals, has contributed to a steady rhythm of survival. Medieval people lived with this understanding at all times. The underground space is not static, it is a system, responsive to care, observation, and patience. You begin by reviewing the structure. Timber supports remain firm, earth walls stable, ventilation channels continue to move air, and drainage grooves manage moisture. Each feature works because it has been maintained, adjusted, and observed. Medieval dwellers understood that neglect undermines even the most carefully constructed shelter. Food stores are inspected. Grain, legumes, root vegetables, and preserved meats remain secure. Any signs of spoilage are addressed immediately. Herbs and absorbent materials control odors and moisture. You realize that careful attention to sustenance is as important as the walls that protect it. Survival depends on both structural and practical diligence. You check bedding and straw, noting subtle shifts from movement, moisture, and use. Adjustments are made to maintain warmth and dryness. Even the smallest lapse could affect comfort, sleep, or health. Medieval underground living required constant engagement with the environment, as well as anticipatory care to prevent issues before they became critical. You attend to animals. Their behavior provides subtle cues about environmental changes. Bedding is refreshed, waste is managed, and feeding remains consistent. Animals contribute to warmth and companionship but demand care. Medieval experience shows that managing their presence is an integral part of daily routines underground. You focus on air and ventilation. Openings are checked and adjusted to maintain a balance of fresh airflow without revealing movement. Air quality affects temperature, moisture, comfort, and health. Observing and managing this flow is continuous work. Medieval people relied on tactile, auditory, and olfactory cues to monitor ventilation effectively. You maintain light sources, Oil lamps and embers provide minimal illumination, enough to conduct essential tasks without attracting attention. Light is managed deliberately. Shadows and flickers are observed and controlled. The balance between visibility and concealment is critical, reflecting centuries of practical experience. You monitor sound. Movement is deliberate and careful. Conversations are whispered only when necessary. Even small noises carry significance underground. Medieval dwellers developed acute auditory awareness, understanding that sound could betray presence, reveal supplies, or signal vulnerability. You check hygiene, personal care, bedding, and surfaces are managed to prevent illness. Ventilation, absorbent materials, and cleanliness combine to reduce risk. Medieval understanding of health in confined spaces relied on careful observation and consistent practice, rather than formal medical knowledge. You reflect on psychological endurance. Darkness, monotony, and confinement challenge attention, patience, and composure. Structured tasks, repetitive routines, and quiet rituals provide stability. Mental resilience is cultivated through continuous engagement with the environment, reinforcing both awareness and adaptability. You observe traces of past activity, worn areas in the floor, smoothed timber, and faint impressions in straw indicate the habits and routines of previous occupants. The shelter preserves a history of adaptation and survival. Medieval underground dwellings accumulate these traces, creating a cumulative record of human endurance. You think about children, birth, and growth underground. The shelter accommodates not only adults but life itself. Careful management of warmth, air, and hygiene protects vulnerable occupants. Medieval families balance the needs of the young with the challenges of concealment and limited resources. You consider superstition and belief. Talismans, symbols, and ritualized actions provide comfort, structure, and mental focus. These practices, interwoven with practical survival strategies, guide behavior and reinforce attentiveness. Medieval dwellers integrated symbolic protections into daily routines, blending psychology with practicality. You revisit your own movement and attention. Every action is deliberate, adjusting bedding, rotating supplies, checking air, monitoring animals, maintaining light, and controlling noise. Each contributes to equilibrium. Medieval life underground depended on this careful orchestration of activity, where even minor lapses could have cascading consequences. You notice the shelter itself responds to these actions. Earth walls settle quietly. Timber supports bear weight consistently. Air circulates as intended. Supplies remain functional. The space operates as a dynamic system, co-created by both structure and human care. Medieval people understood that their survival relied on constant participation in this system. You reflect on endurance. Survival is cumulative, built from countless small, deliberate decisions. Physical, environmental, and psychological factors intertwine. Medieval dwellers internalized this truth persistence. Observation and disciplined care matter more than bravery or luck alone. You consider emergence. The moment to leave is calculated, observing the world above, gauging environmental conditions, and ensuring that health and supplies remain adequate, all inform timing. Medieval people emerged cautiously, understanding that the transition from underground to surface carries risk even after long periods of safety. You sit quietly, hands resting on the earth, absorbing the stillness and the culmination of effort. The shelter holds, not because it exists independently, but because care, attention, and discipline have maintained it. Medieval underground life depended on these ongoing commitments, and as you let your breath slow and your mind settle, you understand that the essence of survival below ground is not simply concealment, food, or structure. It is the steady, continuous engagement with all aspects of the environment, human, animal, and earth itself. Endurance, patience, observation, and care define the life of those who lived in these hidden spaces. The day softens around you. Outside, the world moves in rhythms you no longer need to follow. Here, underground, time is measured by small, deliberate actions rather than sunlight or bells. You feel the shelter settle around you, absorbing the work, the movement, and the quiet attention you have given it. Each wall, each timber, each carefully arranged bundle of straw holds the evidence of care. Life continues, quietly persistent. Even in darkness and solitude, you breathe slowly, letting the rhythm of the space align with your own heartbeat. The fears that came with initial descent fade. Cold, damp, hunger, and uncertainty are tempered by routine, observation, and patient effort. You sense the balance achieved between human vigilance and the stability of the earth. The shelter does not rush. It does not demand. It responds only to your attentiveness, carrying you through hours, days, and nights in steady quiet. You feel the layers of experience that came before you. Those who used this space to endure danger, raise children, or simply survive the shifting world above. Their lives leave subtle marks, traces that persist in worn surfaces and careful arrangements. You close your eyes, letting darkness envelop you completely. The warmth from your body and your careful preparations steadies the space. Breathing slows. Muscles relax. The quiet becomes protective, not oppressive. Every task you performed earlier now folds into a calm sense of mastery. You are both part of the shelter and a witness to its ability to sustain life. Understanding that the greatest survival skill is patience maintained over time. And as the hours pass in silence, you feel the steady assurance of endurance, the quiet triumph of life continuing calmly beneath the earth. Sweet dreams.